Standing outside Dominic Castellano's office, Isabella Romano pressed one trembling hand against her still flat stomach as his voice cut through the door like a blade. He said he'll never have children, that they're nothing but weakness waiting to be exploited. The words shattered something vital inside her chest. For 3 months, she had carried his secret, their child growing beneath her heart, while she navigated the dangerous world of New York's most feared mafia boss. But now she understood the truth. She was alone. And tonight, before he could discover what she'd hidden, Isabella Romano would disappear forever. The Manhattan skyline glittered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Dominic Castellano's penthouse office. Each light was a reminder of the empire he controlled with an iron fist. Isabella Romano had walked these halls for 8 months as his executive assistant. She maintained the perfect facade of professionalism, while her heart betrayed her with every stolen glance. She knew the rules. Everyone who worked for Dominic Castellano knew the rules. Keep your head down. Do your job. Never ask questions about the meetings that happened behind closed doors, or the men who left his office with fear etched into their features. But rules had a way of crumbling when Dominic Castellano turned his full attention on you. It started 6 months ago with a late-night work session. Rain was hammering against the windows as they reviewed acquisition documents for a shipping company. Everyone knew it was a front for moving goods the law would never approve. Isabella had been reaching for a file when Dominic's hand covered hers. His touch sent electricity racing up her arm. He told her she wasn't afraid of him, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. He said everyone else in the building looked at him, like he was a monster waiting to strike, but not her. Isabella had asked if she should be afraid, her voice steadier than she felt. Dominic's smile had been slow, dangerous, and devastating. He admitted she probably should be, but he hadn't let go of her hand, and when he'd kissed her that night, tasting of expensive whiskey and something darker, something forbidden, Isabella had kissed him back with a hunger that surprised them both. Their relationship became a secret wrapped in shadows. Stolen moments between meetings and late nights when the rest of his staff had gone home. Dominic was careful, obsessively so. There were no public appearances together and no traces that could be followed. Isabella understood why. In his world, anything you loved became a target. Weakness meant death. She told herself it was enough. That these hidden hours were all she could expect from a man who commanded an empire built on fear and blood. She never asked for more, never pushed for promises he couldn't make. Then came the morning she'd thrown up in the executive bathroom, her hands shaking as she stared at the positive pregnancy test. 3 months gone. 3 months of carrying Dominic's child while navigating board meetings and contract negotiations, while smiling politely at the men who would kill her without hesitation if they knew she carried the heir to Dominic Castellano's empire. For 2 weeks, Isabella had kept the secret locked tight in her chest, trying to find the right moment to tell him, but the right moment never came. Dominic was in the middle of a territorial dispute with the Moretti family. His attention was consumed by strategy sessions and tense negotiations that sometimes ended with gunfire echoing through the night. She had decided to wait until things calmed down, until she could catch him in one of those rare quiet moments when the hardness in his eyes softened just slightly, when he looked at her like she was something precious instead of just another piece on his chessboard. But today, standing outside his office with her hand pressed against her stomach, Isabella learned that some moments of truth arrived whether you were ready or not. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap she could see Dominic seated behind his massive mahogany desk. His second-in-command, Marco, was standing across from him. They were discussing business, the usual topics of territory shipments and payment schedules. Isabella had been about to knock to deliver the quarterly reports. Dominic had requested when Marco's next words froze her in place. Marco said that Dominic's cousin had called again, his tone carefully neutral. He was asking when Dominic was going to settle down and give the family an heir. He thought it was time. Dominic's laugh was cold and sharp enough to cut. He said his cousin could mind his own damn business, and that he'd told him 100 times he wasn't interested in playing happy family. Marco pressed, saying his cousin thought it would strengthen Dominic's position. A wife and children, it shows stability. It makes you look less. What? Dominic's voice dropped to that dangerous quiet that made seasoned criminals flinch. Less ruthless? Less effective? He asked Marco exactly how saddling himself with a family would make him stronger. Marco shifted his weight, uncomfortable. He said it was tradition, and mentioned Dominic's father. Dominic cut him off with brutal efficiency, saying his father was dead, killed by men who used his family against him. They took his mother hostage. Marco had put a gun to her head and forced him to kneel. That's what family gets you in this business. A weakness your enemies can exploit. Isabella's hand tightened against her stomach, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. Dominic continued, his words precise and merciless. He told Marco that the next time his cousin called, he should tell him that his position was clear. He would never have children. They were nothing but a liability, a weakness, waiting to be exploited by anyone smart enough to see the opportunity. He said a child would be a target with a bullseye painted on their back from the moment they drew their first breath. He wouldn't create that vulnerability. Not for tradition. Not for anyone. The quarterly report slipped from Isabella's numb fingers, hitting the marble floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the terrible silence following Dominic's declaration. Through the gap in the door, she saw Dominic's head turn sharply toward the noise. Isabella didn't wait for him to investigate. She turned and walked away with measured steps that wanted desperately to become a run, her mind screaming with the implications of what she'd just heard. Every word had been a nail in the coffin of the fragile hope she'd been nursing for 2 weeks. He would never have children. They were nothing but a liability. She made it to the executive bathroom before the first sob tore from her throat. Isabella locked herself in a stall, pressing her fist against her mouth to muffle the sounds of her breaking heart. The child growing inside her, Dominic's child, would never be welcome, would never be anything but the weakness he despised, the liability he refused to create. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from Dominic asking where the third quarter reports were. Isabella stared at the message through blurred vision, then typed back with shaking fingers. She said she'd dropped them and was bringing a new copy. She couldn't do this. Couldn't walk back into that office and hand him papers while her world crumbled around her. Couldn't look into those dark eyes and pretend she hadn't heard him systematically destroy any future they might have had together. But she had to, just once more, because Isabella needed to see his face when she lied to it. 10 minutes later, after repairing her makeup and forcing her features into a mask of professional calm, Isabella knocked on Dominic's office door. He said to come in. He was alone now. Marco had departed on whatever errand Dominic had assigned. The Manhattan skyline stretched behind him like a kingdom he'd conquered through blood and strategy. At 42, Dominic Castellano was devastatingly handsome in the way dangerous things often were. All sharp edges and controlled power wrapped in a custom Italian suit. His dark hair held just enough silver at the temples to add gravity, and those eyes could strip a person bare with a single glance. Right now they were focused on Isabella with a concern that felt like a knife twisting in her chest. He asked if she was all right, rising from his chair. He said she looked pale. The lie tasted like ash. She said she was fine, just a headache, and handed him the reports. She placed the folder on his desk, careful not to let their fingers touch. Dominic frowned, his sharp instincts clearly picking up on something wrong. But Isabella was already turning away. He told her to wait. His voice stopped her at the door. She turned back, forcing herself to meet his eyes one last time. This man who had touched her with such devastating tenderness in the darkness. This man whose child grew beneath her heart while he sat there completely unaware, having just declared that child nothing but a weakness he would never willingly create. She formally asked what he needed, Mr. Castellano. The formal address made something flicker in his expression. Surprise, maybe hurt. They only used titles in front of others, maintaining the professional distance that protected them both. But Isabella needed that distance now more than ever. He asked again if she was sure she was all right, his tone softer now, edged with something that might have been worry. Isabella smiled, the expression feeling like her face might crack from the effort. She said she was perfectly fine, just tired. She then asked if she could take the rest of the day off, if that was acceptable. She saw him hesitate, saw the war in his eyes between the boss who maintained strict control and the man who'd held her through countless nights. Finally, he nodded. Of course, he said. Rest. We'll talk later. But there would be no later, because Isabella Romano had made her decision standing outside his office, hearing him systematically destroy any hope she'd harbored for a future together. She would leave tonight before he could discover the truth about the life growing inside her. Before her child could become the weakness he despised, the liability he would view with resentment instead of love. A child deserved better than that. Deserved better than a father who saw them as a vulnerability to be avoided. She quietly said, "Thank you, Mr. Castellano, for everything." Something in her tone made Dominic's eyes narrow, his instincts clearly screaming warnings. He started to move around the desk, calling her name, but she was already gone, closing the door softly behind her and walking toward an elevator that would carry her out of this building and out of Dominic Castellano's life forever. The apartment Isabella had been renting in Brooklyn was small but comfortable. It was a far cry from the luxury of Dominic's world, but paid for with her own salary rather than his dangerous money. She'd insisted on keeping it throughout their relationship, maintaining this small piece of independence, even when Dominic had offered repeatedly to set her up somewhere better. Now, as Isabella systematically packed her belongings into 3 suitcases, she was grateful for that stubborn independence. Grateful that this space was entirely hers, untainted by Dominic's resources or influence. She worked quickly, methodically, her mind shut down against the screaming emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. Clothes were folded with precise corners, documents gathered and organized. Her passport, birth certificate, and the small amount of cash she'd saved all went into a leather bag that would stay within arm's reach. Isabella had always been a planner. Growing up poor in the Bronx had taught her to think 3 steps ahead, to always have an exit strategy. Even when she'd fallen into Dominic's bed, fallen into feelings she knew were dangerous. Some part of her had kept a corner of her life separate, untouchable, ready for the day when this beautiful, terrible thing between them would inevitably end. She just hadn't expected it to end like this. Hadn't expected to be running not from danger or discovery, but from the simple truth that the man she loved would never want the child she carried. Her phone buzzed repeatedly throughout the evening. Dominic was calling and texting, his messages growing increasingly concerned as she ignored each one. He asked if she was home and told her to call him. He texted that she was worrying him and pleaded to at least let him know she was safe. Each message made her heart clench, but Isabella deleted them all. She couldn't afford to waver, couldn't afford to hear his voice and lose her resolve. By midnight, her apartment was empty except for the furniture that had come with the lease. Isabella stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at space where she'd imagined a different future, a future where maybe somehow she and Dominic could have made this work. But that future had died today outside his office, killed by words spoken in casual certainty. He would never have children. Isabella placed her hand against her stomach, feeling the slight swell that would soon become impossible to hide. She whispered to the life growing inside her that it was just them now. But she promised it would be wanted. She promised it would be loved. The cab she'd called pulled up outside at 12:47 a.m. Isabella took one last look at the building, then climbed in with her suitcases. The driver asked where to. She told him Penn Station. She had a train ticket to Boston in her purse, purchased with cash earlier that afternoon. From Boston, she would go to Portland. From Portland, maybe Seattle. Far enough that Dominic's network would have trouble following. Far enough that she could disappear into a new life. The city scrolled past the cab's windows, each familiar street a goodbye. Isabella pressed her forehead against the glass and let the tears come finally and silently, while the driver pretended not to notice. She was doing the right thing for her child, for herself, even if it felt like dying. Dominic Castellano stood in Isabella's empty apartment at 2 a.m., his phone pressed to his ear, as Marco's voice delivered the news he'd been dreading. The landlord said she turned in her keys 3 hours ago, paid through the end of the month, and left with no forwarding address. Dominic's voice was deadly calm, the tone that preceded violence. He said to find her. He didn't care what they had to do. Marco started to say that if she didn't want to be found, then Dominic cut him off. He ordered him to pull traffic camera footage and check train stations, bus terminals, and airports. He told him to send someone to watch her family in the Bronx. He wanted to know where Isabella Romano went, and he wanted to know by morning. He ended the call and turned slowly in the empty apartment, trying to understand what had happened. This morning, everything had been fine. Isabella had been her usual efficient self, bringing him coffee exactly how he liked it, organizing his schedule with the precision he'd come to depend on. Then something had changed. That moment in his office, when she'd looked at him with such devastating sadness, calling him Mr. Castellano in a tone that felt like goodbye. He wondered what he missed. Dominic prided himself on reading people, on seeing threats before they materialized and opportunities before they ripened. But with Isabella, he'd been blind, too close to see clearly, too invested to recognize the warning signs. His phone buzzed with a text from Marco. It said he was checking stations now, and there was no credit card activity since this afternoon. Of course not. Isabella was smart. Too smart to leave a trail he could follow. Dominic sank onto the couch she'd left behind, exhaustion pulling at him for the first time in years. He'd built an empire through ruthless efficiency and calculated risk. He controlled territory from Manhattan to New Jersey, commanded loyalty through fear and respect in equal measure. Men twice his age deferred to his judgment. Politicians returned his calls. Police looked the other way when his name came up. But none of that power meant anything if he couldn't find one woman who decided to disappear. The question haunted him, why did you run? Dawn broke over the city, painting the empty apartment in shades of gold and amber. Dominic had never felt more powerless in his life, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a terrible suspicion was beginning to form. A memory of Isabella's hand pressed against her stomach when she'd thought he wasn't looking, the way she'd been pale and tired lately. The subtle changes he'd noticed but hadn't questioned. No, it couldn't be that, could it? Dominic pulled out his phone and dialed his private doctor, a man who knew better than to ask questions or violate confidentiality. He said he needed him to check something for him, because if his suspicion was correct, if Isabella had left because she was carrying his child, then Dominic Castellano had made the biggest mistake of his life, and he had no idea how to fix it. 3 weeks later, Isabella watched the rain streak down the window of her rented room in Portland, one hand unconsciously rubbing the slight swell of her stomach. 4 months now. Soon she'd need looser clothes, need to start making plans for when the pregnancy became impossible to hide. She'd found work at a bookstore, getting paid cash under the table by an owner who didn't ask too many questions. The room she rented was small and cold, a far cry from the life she'd left behind, but it was safe and anonymous. Or at least she'd thought it was. The news alert on her phone made her blood run cold. Castellano Organization increases security measures. CEO unavailable for comment. The article was brief, carefully worded to avoid anything actionable, but Isabella could read between the lines. Dominic was mobilizing resources, looking for something or someone. Her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. Isabella stared at it, her heart hammering. She'd changed her number the day she left New York and had given it to exactly 3 people. Her new landlord, her employer, and her mother, which meant whoever was calling had resources to track her down. The call went to voicemail. Isabella waited, then played the message with shaking hands. It was Dominic's voice. It flooded through the speaker, and she nearly dropped the phone. He said he knew she didn't want to hear from him, and that she left for a reason, but he pleaded with her to please call him back. He said whatever he did, whatever he said, they could fix it. He just wanted her to tell him where she was. There was a pause, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something raw, almost broken. He said he was sorry for whatever he did to make her leave. He just wanted to know she was safe. The message ended. Isabella sat frozen, tears streaming down her face as Dominic's voice echoed in her mind. He sounded devastated, lost, like a man searching for something precious that had slipped through his fingers. But he didn't know about the baby. Didn't know that the weakness he despised was growing inside with every passing day. Isabella deleted the message and turned off her phone. Some distances were too far to cross. Some words once spoken couldn't be taken back. And some children deserved fathers who wanted them from the very beginning. Not men who would see them as liabilities, weaknesses waiting to be exploited. Even if walking away felt like carving out her own heart. Dominic stared at his phone, willing it to ring, willing Isabella to call back to give him any sign that she was all right. Nothing. Marco knocked on his office door, entering with the caution of a man approaching a wounded animal. He told his boss they got something. Dominic's head snapped up. He asked where. Marco said it was security footage from Penn Station the night she disappeared. He pulled up the video on his tablet. He explained they had to go through 3 weeks of recordings, but they found her. The video showed Isabella moving through the crowded station, 3 suitcases trailing behind her. She looked small, vulnerable in a way that made Dominic's chest tighten. She stopped at a ticket counter, exchanged cash for something, then disappeared into the crowd. Dominic demanded to know where she went. Marco said they were still tracking it, but there was something else. Something he needed to see. He pulled up another image, this one from a different camera angle. It was Isabella, standing in profile. Her hand pressed against her stomach in a gesture that was becoming familiar from the footage they'd collected. But in this image, the angle of the camera caught something Marco's team had noticed in other footage too. A slight curve to Isabella's abdomen that hadn't been there 4 months ago. A telltale sign that Dominic had been too blind to see when she was standing right in front of him. Marco said quietly that she's pregnant. Their medical consultant estimated she was about 4 months along. Dominic's voice came out strangled. He realized the baby was his, and she left because of him. The conversation with Marco 3 weeks ago came rushing back. Every word Dominic had spoken about children being liabilities, weaknesses, vulnerabilities he would never create. Every casual declaration that he would never have a family. And Isabella had been standing outside his door, listening to him systematically destroy any hope she might have had. Oh God. Dominic sank into his chair, the full weight of his mistake crashing down on him. She heard him. That day, when he and Marco were talking about his cousin's suggestions, Isabella was outside and she heard everything he said. He thought to himself that she was carrying a child, and she ran because she thought he would see the baby as a burden. Dominic's hands were shaking now, a tremor he couldn't control. She thought he wouldn't want them. The irony was devastating. For 6 months, Dominic had been falling for Isabella Romano. He'd been fighting against feelings he'd sworn never to have again. He'd kept their relationship secret, not because he was ashamed, but because in his world, anything you loved became a target. His father had taught him that lesson in blood. But in trying to protect Isabella by keeping her at a distance, by maintaining the facade of the ruthless businessman who needed nothing and no one, Dominic had driven her away when she needed him most, when their child needed him most. His voice was hard with determination. He told Marco to find her. He said to pull every resource they have. He didn't care what it cost or who they had to pressure. He wanted Isabella Romano found, and he wanted it done yesterday. Because Dominic Castellano had just realized something that terrified him more than any enemy ever could. He was in love with a woman who was carrying his child, and he had no idea if he could convince her to come back. But he would try, even if it meant tearing down every wall he'd built around his heart and showing her the truth he'd been too afraid to admit. He loved her. He wanted their child. And he would spend the rest of his life proving it if she would just give him the chance. The hunt consumed Dominic in ways nothing else ever had. For 2 months, he threw every resource at his disposal into finding Isabella. Private investigators, tech experts who could track digital footprints that most people didn't even know they left, and contacts in cities across the country who owed him favors. The search became an obsession that aided him during every waking moment and haunted his dreams when exhaustion finally dragged him under. Marco watched his boss unravel with growing concern. The man who had always been calculated and controlled was making decisions driven by emotion rather than strategy. It was dangerous in their world. Emotion got you killed. One night, Marco found Dominic in his office at 3 a.m, surrounded by reports and surveillance footage. He told his boss he needed to sleep, that he'd been at it for 18 hours straight. Dominic didn't look up from the security image he was examining. It was a blurry shot from a convenience store in Seattle that might have been Isabella, or might have been any dark-haired woman with similar features. He said she was 5 months pregnant now, maybe 6. She needed prenatal care, vitamins, a doctor monitoring the baby's development. Marco said she was smart enough to take care of herself. Dominic's voice cracked slightly when he asked if she was. He wondered if she was so afraid of him finding her that she was avoiding hospitals, paying cash for everything, and staying off the grid. The question hung in the air between them. Marco had no answer because they both knew the truth. Isabella was exactly that smart and exactly that afraid. Marco said quietly they would find her. The team in Portland had reported a possible sighting yesterday. Dark hair, about the right age, working at a bookstore on the east side. Dominic's head snapped up, hope flaring in his exhausted eyes. He told Marco to send someone to confirm, but to observe only. He didn't want them to approach her or scare her. If it was Isabella, he wanted to know immediately, and he would handle it himself. Marco said he understood, but the Portland lead turned out to be another dead end. A woman with similar features, but the wrong eyes, the wrong walk, the wrong everything. Dominic received the news while in a meeting with the Moretti family, negotiating a truce that would have demanded his full attention under normal circumstances. Instead, he found himself agreeing to terms he would have fought against just to end the meeting faster. Vincent Redcenter observed with his sharp-aged eyes that Dominic was distracted. He said it wasn't like him and asked what had him twisted up. Dominic considered lying, then realized he was too tired to maintain the facade. He admitted it was personal matters. Vincent's weathered face creased into something that might have been sympathy as he asked if it was a woman. Dominic said it was a woman he lost because he was too stupid to see what he had until she was gone. The old man nodded slowly, an understanding passing between them despite decades of rivalry. He said his Rosa had left him once back in the early days. She'd taken their daughter and disappeared for 3 months because he'd said something cruel, something he didn't mean. He said pride almost kept him from going after her. Dominic asked what changed his mind. Vincent replied that he realized that ruling an empire means nothing if you're sitting alone in an empty house at the end of the day. He studied Dominic with an intensity that made him feel transparent. He told Dominic that whatever he said, whatever he did, he should fix it. Because regret is a poison that kills slower than a bullet, but just as thoroughly. The words stayed with Dominic long after the meeting ended, echoing through his mind as he returned to his office and the endless search. Vincent Moretti had built a life with his Rosa, had raised children and grandchildren, had created something beyond money and power. Dominic wanted that with an ache that surprised him with its intensity. He wanted Isabella. He wanted their child. He wanted the future he'd been too afraid to imagine. His phone rang at midnight. Marco's voice was tight with controlled excitement. He said they found her, Chicago. A clinic on the south side had run her ID for a prenatal appointment yesterday. Dominic was on his feet instantly, his exhaustion vanishing under a surge of adrenaline. He asked if he was certain. Marco confirmed the clinic requires identification for first visits. She'd used her real name and real social security number. Their contact in the records department confirmed it was her. The address was already sent to his phone. Marco asked if he wanted backup. Dominic considered the question while pulling on his jacket and checking the gun he always carried. He decided this was something he needed to do alone. Marco warned she might run again. Dominic's voice was calm and certain. He said he would follow. However long it takes, however far she goes, he would follow. Because she was carrying his child and he was in love with her. And those were 2 facts that weren't changing, regardless of how much distance she put between them. The admission hung in the air. Marco was silent for a long moment, then quietly wished him good luck. Dominic's private plane was fueled and ready within the hour. He spent the 3-hour flight to Chicago rehearsing what he would say, discarding every speech that felt too calculated, too much like a business negotiation. This wasn't a deal to be struck or a contract to be signed. This was his life, his future, his heart laid bare. The address Marco had provided led to a modest apartment building in a neighborhood that made Dominic's security instincts scream warnings. This was the kind of area where people minded their own business because getting involved meant trouble. Where sirens were background noise and broken streetlights stayed broken. Isabella was living here, pregnant and alone, in a building with a broken security door and graffiti sprayed across the brick walls. The rage that swept through Dominic was cold and focused. She should have been in his penthouse, surrounded by security and comfort, eating organic food prepared by his private chef and sleeping in Egyptian cotton sheets. Instead, she was here, hiding from him in a place that made his skin crawl with protective fury. He climbed the 3 flights of stairs to apartment 3C. his footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. Dominic raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. What if she refused to open the door? What if she saw him through the peephole and called the police? What if she looked at him with the same devastation he'd seen in his office 2 months ago and told him to leave? Dominic knocked anyway. 3 firm raps that sounded too loud in the quiet hallway. Nothing. He knocked again. He called her name, saying he knew she was in there and he just wanted to talk. Silence answered him. But Dominic could feel her presence on the other side of the door, could sense her fear and her uncertainty as clearly as if she'd spoken. He pressed his palm against the worn wood, imagining he could feel her warmth through it. He said quietly that he wasn't leaving. He would stand there all night if that's what it took. He'd come back every day until she talked to him. Because he needed to tell her something, and he needed her to hear it. More silence. Then, so faintly he almost missed it, Isabella's voice came through the door. She told him to go away. The sound of her voice after 2 months hit him like a physical blow. He said he couldn't do that. She insisted he had to, that there was nothing there for him. He replied that she was there, and that was everything. He heard her sharp intake of breath. He heard what might have been a sob quickly stifled. She said he didn't want this, that he'd made that very clear. He admitted he was wrong. The words came out rough, scraped raw from his throat. He said he was so wrong about everything, and he needed to explain. He pleaded for 5 minutes. That's all he was asking. Her voice broke as she said she couldn't do this with him. She couldn't let him back in just to. He told her he loved her. The confession exploded into the space between them. 3 words Dominic had never said to anyone except his mother before she died. 3 words he'd sworn he would never say, because love was weakness. Love was vulnerability. Love got you killed. But standing in this dingy hallway, separated from the woman carrying his child by a door and 2 months of mistakes, Dominic finally understood what Vincent Moretti had tried to tell him. Power meant nothing without someone to share it with. An empire built on fear crumbled into dust when there was no one to pass it to. He said it again, softer this time, that he loved her. He'd loved her for months. Maybe from the first moment she looked at him without fear in her eyes. And he was too much of a coward to admit it, too afraid of what it meant. But he told her he was done being afraid. He was done lying to himself about what he wanted. The lock clicked, the door opened a crack, and Dominic found himself looking into Isabella's face for the first time in 2 months. She'd changed, lost weight everywhere except her stomach, which curved beneath an oversized sweater in an unmistakable swell. Her face was thinner, shadows beneath her eyes, speaking of sleepless nights and worry. But she was still the most beautiful thing Dominic had ever seen. She whispered that he shouldn't be here. But she didn't close the door. He told her there was nowhere else he'd rather be. Dominic kept his hands carefully at his sides, fighting the urge to reach for her. He asked if he could come in. Isabella hesitated, a war playing across her expressive features. Finally, she stepped back and opened the door wider. She said 5 minutes, that's all. The apartment was tiny, a studio with a kitchenette in one corner, and a bathroom visible through a partially open door. But it was clean, organized with the same precision Isabella had brought to managing his office. A small bookshelf held medical texts about pregnancy and childbirth. Baby clothes were folded neatly in an open box beside the bed. She was preparing for their child, alone. The realization threatened to break Dominic's carefully maintained composure. He turned to face Isabella, who stood near the door with her arms wrapped protectively around her stomach. He asked quietly when she was going to tell him. The honesty in her voice was brutal. She said she wasn't. She told him he'd made it very clear how he felt about children, and she wasn't going to force him into something he didn't want. He said she should have given him the choice. Isabella's eyes flashed with anger, the first real emotion beyond fear that she'd shown. She asked why. So he could resent her, resent the baby, so he could do his duty while hating every moment of it? He asked if that was really what she thought of him. She said she thought he was a man who knew exactly what he wanted. And he told Marco, told anyone who would listen, that children were liabilities he would never accept, weaknesses waiting to be exploited. Her voice shook. She said she wouldn't let her child grow up feeling like a burden. Dominic absorbed the words, the pain in them, the absolute conviction. This was the image Isabella had carried for 2 months of a man who would view their child as nothing more than a strategic disadvantage. He said she was right and watched surprise flicker across her face. He admitted he did say those things, and he even believed them. For years, he told himself that family was a luxury he couldn't afford in this life. That caring about people made you vulnerable. She asked why he was here. He said because he was lying to himself. Dominic took a careful step closer. He explained that his father died protecting his mother. They held a gun to her head and made him kneel, and he watched him choose her life over his own. He was 15 years old, and he swore he would never give anyone that kind of power over me. He would never love someone so much that losing them could destroy him. Isabella's expression softened slightly, understanding beginning to dawn. He continued, saying that then she walked into his office 8 months ago with her resume and her determination, and she looked at him like he was just a man instead of a monster, and every day after that, she chipped away at the walls he'd built until he couldn't remember why he'd built them in the first place. He took another step. He confessed that he fell in love with her completely and terrifyingly, and he was too afraid to admit it, even to himself. She realized that's why he pushed her away. He explained that he kept her at a distance because he thought that would protect her. He thought if no one knew how much she meant to him, she'd be safe. Dominic's laugh was bitter. But all he did was make her believe he didn't care, that she didn't matter. Tears were sliding down Isabella's cheeks now, and Dominic wanted desperately to wipe them away. But he kept his hands at his sides, knowing he hadn't earned the right to touch her yet. He continued, explaining that the conversation she overheard, every word of it was a lie he'd told himself so many times he believed it. Children were liabilities because he couldn't imagine loving someone that much. Family was weakness because he was too afraid to admit he wanted one. And then she disappeared, and Marco showed him the security footage, and he saw his voice broke. Dominic swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue. He saw she was pregnant, and everything he thought he knew shattered. Because suddenly all he could think about was her carrying their child alone, her going through doctor's appointments without anyone to hold her hand, her afraid and uncertain with no one to tell her it would be okay. She said she managed. He said she shouldn't have had to. Dominic closed the remaining distance between them, stopping just close enough that he could feel her warmth. He said he wanted this baby. He wanted her. He wanted the family he was too afraid to admit he needed, and he knew he didn't deserve a second chance after what he said, after how badly he failed her. But he was asking anyway. Isabella looked up at him with those eyes that had haunted his dreams, searching his face for the truth. She asked how she could know he wouldn't change his mind, that he wouldn't wake up one day and resent them for making him vulnerable. He admitted that she didn't. The admission was painful, but necessary. He said he couldn't prove his feelings with words. He could only show her through actions, through choices, through being the man she and their child deserve. She said that wasn't good enough. The rejection hit like a bullet, but Dominic forced himself to accept it. He told her to tell him what would be good enough. Tell him what he needed to do, and he would do it. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, her hand pressed against her stomach where their child grew. Finally, she moved to a small desk in the corner and pulled out an envelope. She handed it to Dominic with shaking fingers. He asked what it was. She told him to open it. Dominic tore open the envelope and pulled out legal documents. His eyes scanned the pages, confusion mounting with every line he read. These were custody papers, giving her full parental rights with no claims from the father. She said that's what she needed, her voice steady, despite the tears still streaming down her face. She needed to know that if he changed his mind, if he decided this was too much, he wouldn't take her baby away from her. She needed the protection of knowing that she was the one who decided what happened. He started to speak her name, but she continued quickly. She said she wasn't trying to cut him out, but she needed the security of knowing that her child wouldn't be a pawn in some custody battle. That if he woke up one day and remembered all the reasons he thought children were liabilities, she could protect them from that rejection. Dominic looked at the papers in his hands, understanding flooding through him. This wasn't about keeping him away from the baby. This was about Isabella protecting herself and their child from the possibility of future pain. This was her asking him to prove legally, bindingly, that he was choosing them freely, not out of obligation. He asked if she had a pen. Isabella blinked in surprise. He said he needed a pen to sign them. Dominic met her eyes steadily. He said if she wanted assurance that he wouldn't use his power against her or their child, that he was choosing this freely, not because he felt trapped, then he would sign whatever she needed him to sign. She asked if he would give up all legal rights to his own child. He said yes, if that's what it took for her to feel safe. He found a pen on her desk and clicked it open. But he told her he needed her to understand something. He was signing these because he loved her and he trusted her, not because he didn't want to be a father. He promised to be there for every doctor's appointment, from now on, every ultrasound, every moment of this pregnancy, and every day after their child was born. He said these papers didn't change that. His signature was bold and decisive across the bottom of each page. When he finished, Dominic set the papers aside and took Isabella's hands in his, feeling the tremor that ran through her fingers. He said quietly that he couldn't undo the past 2 months. He couldn't take back the words she heard, or the pain he caused. But he could promise her this. He would spend every day for the rest of his life proving that he wanted them both, that they weren't a liability or a weakness, that they were the most important thing in his world. Isabella's composure finally crumbled. She sagged forward, and Dominic caught her, pulling her carefully into his arms and feeling her pregnant belly press against him. Their child, right there, real and growing, and already loved more than he'd thought possible. Isabella sobbed against his chest that she was so scared and alone, and she didn't know what to do. He told her he was so sorry. Dominic pressed his face into her hair, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo mixed with something new, something maternal and precious. He said she should never have had to be alone. That was his failure, his mistake. They stood like that for a long time, Isabella crying out 2 months of fear and loneliness, while Dominic held her and murmured apologies and promises into her hair. Finally, her tears slowed, and she pulled back slightly to look up at him. She said this didn't fix everything, her voice rough. She was still angry at him, still hurt. He said he knew, and that she needed time to trust that this was real, that he wouldn't change his mind when the reality of having a child hit him. He told her to take all the time she needed. Dominic cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing away the remaining tears. He promised he would be here, proving himself, showing her that he meant every word. Isabella searched his eyes, looking for cracks in his conviction. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly. She said okay, but she wasn't moving back to New York right away. She needed space to figure this out. He said then he would get an apartment there. He would be close but not suffocating. She told him he couldn't just uproot his entire life. His smile was wry. He told her to watch him. He had excellent people managing things in New York. Marco could handle day-to-day operations while he was here. And for things that absolutely required his presence, there were airplanes. Despite everything, Isabella laughed, a small watery sound that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. She called him impossible. He said he was determined and there was a difference. Dominic sobered, his expression turning serious. He told her he meant what he said. He loved her. He loved their child, and he would do whatever it takes to build a life with them both, even if that meant proving himself from a distance, while she decided whether to trust him again. Isabella was quiet for a moment, her hand returning to her stomach in that protective gesture Dominic was coming to recognize. Finally, she said she had a doctor's appointment next Tuesday, an ultrasound to check the baby's development. He asked what time. She said 2 o'clock. He said he would be there. He then added carefully that he would be there if she wanted him to be. She admitted softly that she did, despite everything. Despite how angry she was, she wanted their child to have a father. A real father who was present and involved. He promised that's what he would be. Dominic pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, the gesture chaste and full of promise. He thanked her for giving him this chance and promised he wouldn't waste it. He forced himself to step back, to put distance between them, even though everything in him screamed to stay. But Isabella needed space, needed time to process everything that had just happened. Pushing too hard, too fast would only drive her away again. He reluctantly said he should go to let her rest. But he would call tomorrow, if that was all right, to check in and see how she was feeling. Isabella nodded, exhaustion evident in the lines of her face. She said okay. Dominic moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. He had one more thing. He said he knew this apartment was what she could afford on her own, and he respected her independence. But he asked her to please let him get her somewhere safer, somewhere with better security, and a building that didn't have a broken front door. He said it wasn't because he was trying to control her, but because the idea of her and their baby in this neighborhood terrified him. He saw the refusal forming on her lips and added quickly that she could pick the place anywhere in Chicago she wanted. He would pay the rent, but the lease would be in her name. She would have complete control. He just needed to know she was safe. Isabella considered this, war playing across her features. Finally, she said she would think about it. He said, "That's all?" he asked. Dominic opened the door, then looked back one more time. He told her to get some rest, and he would see her Tuesday. He walked down the 3 flights of stairs and out into the Chicago night, his heart feeling simultaneously lighter and heavier than it had in months. Lighter because he'd found Isabella, because she'd agreed to let him try to prove himself. Heavier because he'd seen the fear and hurt in her eyes, understood the depth of the damage his careless words had caused. But Dominic Castellano hadn't built an empire by giving up when things got difficult. He'd built it through persistence, through strategic planning, through seeing what needed to be done and doing it regardless of the obstacles. Winning back Isabella's trust would be the most important campaign of his life, and he intended to win. Marco was waiting when Dominic's plane touched down in New York at dawn. His second-in-command took one look at Dominic's face and said that he found her. Dominic confirmed it and that she was giving him a chance to prove himself. He headed toward the waiting car, his mind already working through logistics. He told Marco he needed him to clear his schedule for the next 3 months. Anything that absolutely required his presence would be moved to video conferences or delayed. Everything else Marco would handle. Marco's eyebrows rose. He asked if Dominic was staying in Chicago. Not full-time, but he would be there more than here. Dominic climbed into the back seat, Marco sliding in beside him. He explained she was 6 months pregnant, alone, and still deciding whether to trust him again. He needed to show her he was serious about being present for this. Marco warned the families wouldn't like him being absent so much. Dominic's tone made it clear this wasn't up for debate. He said the families could adjust. He then told Marco to find him an apartment in Chicago. Somewhere nice, but not ostentatious. Close to Isabella, but not so close that he was hovering. Marco said with a slight smile that he was already looking into properties, figuring he'd want to stay near her. Dominic said he knew him too well. Marco replied that someone had to. He pulled out his tablet, bringing up a list of potential apartments. He added there was also the matter of security. If Dominic was splitting time between cities, they needed protocols in place to keep both locations secure. They spent the drive discussing logistics, setting up the infrastructure that would allow Dominic to maintain his business while being present for Isabella and their child. By the time they reached Dominic's Manhattan penthouse, the framework was in place. But as Dominic stood in his bedroom, the room where he'd held Isabella countless times, where they'd shared whispered conversations in the dark, the enormity of what he was trying to accomplish hit him. He was asking her to trust him again after he'd shattered that trust, asking her to believe his promises when his past actions had proven him capable of devastating carelessness. It wasn't enough to just show up. He needed to show her through actions, through choices, through becoming the man she and their child deserved. Starting with the doctor's appointment on Tuesday. Dominic pulled out his phone and called a private doctor in New York. He said he needed recommendations for the best OBGYN in Chicago, someone who specialized in high-risk pregnancies. The doctor asked if everything was all right. Dominic said he was going to be a father, the word still feeling foreign and wonderful on his tongue, and he wanted to make sure the mother of his child had access to the best possible care. The call lasted 20 minutes, ending with a list of 3 highly recommended specialists in Chicago. Dominic sent the information to Isabella with a simple text. He wrote that these doctors came highly recommended if she wanted a second opinion. No pressure, just options. Her response came an hour later. It said thank you, and that she would look into them. It was a start. Small, tentative, but a start nonetheless. Tuesday arrived with agonizing slowness. Dominic flew back to Chicago Monday night, checking into a suite at the Four Seasons rather than the apartment Marco had found. He wanted to give Isabella space, not crowd her with his proximity. He spent Tuesday morning in back-to-back video conferences, handling business matters with half his attention, while the other half counted down the minutes until 2 o'clock. At 1:30, Dominic pulled up outside Isabella's apartment building. She emerged 10 minutes later, dressed in maternity clothes that couldn't quite hide how much weight she'd lost in her face and limbs, despite her growing belly. She stopped short when she saw him leaning against the car, surprise flickering across her features. She asked if he came. He said he would. Dominic opened the passenger door. He'd learned not to make promises he couldn't keep. Isabella hesitated, then slid into the car. She said the clinic was on the north side, about 20 minutes from there. They drove in silence, tension humming between them. Dominic wanted to fill the quiet with reassurances, with promises and explanations, but he forced himself to wait to let Isabella set the pace. Finally, she spoke. She said she'd looked at those doctor recommendations he sent, called the first one on the list, and she was taking new patients. She had an appointment with her next week for a full workup. Isabella glanced at him. The practice was in a better neighborhood than her current clinic. Much better. Dominic kept his eyes on the road and said good, that she deserved the best care available. She said it was expensive. He replied that he didn't care what it cost. Isabella was quiet for a moment, then said softly, "Thank you for the referrals and for being here." He said she didn't need to thank him for doing what he should have been doing all along. Dominic reached across the console and took her hand carefully. He told her this was where he wanted to be, right here, beside her. Her fingers tightened around his, and Dominic felt something in his chest ease slightly. They had a long way to go, mountains of hurt to work through, but in this moment, Isabella was letting him hold her hand. It was enough. The clinic was busy, the waiting room filled with other expectant mothers in various stages of pregnancy. Dominic stayed close to Isabella as she checked in, his hand a steady pressure at the small of her back. Other women glanced at them curiously, no doubt wondering about the man in the expensive suit accompanying the nervous-looking pregnant woman. A nurse appeared in the doorway and called Isabella's name. They followed her back to an examination room where Isabella was instructed to change into a gown. Dominic waited outside, giving her privacy, then knocked softly before entering when she called for him. She looked impossibly vulnerable, sitting on the examination table in the thin gown, her hand pressed protectively over her belly. Dominic moved to stand beside her, careful not to crowd, waiting for permission. Isabella gestured to the chair beside the exam table and told him he could sit. The doctor arrived minutes later, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an efficient manner. She greeted Miss Romano and noted that this must be the baby's father. They both said yes, simultaneously. The doctor smiled and said it was wonderful to have them both here. She said they should take a look at how their little one was developing. The ultrasound machine was wheeled over, and Dominic watched as the doctor squeezed gel onto Isabella's exposed stomach. The wand pressed against her skin, moving in slow circles, while grainy images appeared on the screen beside them. Then suddenly there it was. A tiny form curled in the darkness. Features were visible in profile. Arms and legs, fingers and toes, a heartbeat pulsing steady and strong. Their child. Dominic felt his breath catch, emotion slamming into him with the force of a freight train. That was his son or daughter. That tiny, perfect being existed because of a night when he and Isabella had come together. When they'd created something beautiful out of their secret love. The doctor was saying that everything looked good, her voice seeming to come from very far away. The baby was measuring right on track for 24 weeks. The heartbeat was strong and steady. She asked if they would like to know the sex. Dominic looked at Isabella, leaving the choice to her. She met his eyes, and in that moment, something passed between them. A shared wonder, a recognition that whatever had come before, whatever pain they still needed to work through, this child was theirs. Isabella whispered yes, that they'd like to know. The doctor smiled and pointed to the screen. She said congratulations, they were having a girl, a daughter. Dominic was going to have a daughter. He looked back at the screen at the tiny form of his child and felt tears sting his eyes for the first time since his mother's funeral. A little girl who would have Isabella's strength and courage, who he would protect with every breath in his body. His voice was rough as he managed to say she was perfect. Isabella agreed. And when Dominic looked at her, he saw tears streaming down her face too. The rest of the appointment passed in a blur of information. Due dates and vitamin recommendations and signs to watch for. Dominic absorbed all of it, filing away every detail. When they finally left the clinic, he was carrying printouts of ultrasound images and a head full of plans. As they reached the car, he asked if she was hungry. They could get dinner and talk. Isabella hesitated, then nodded. She said there was a small Italian place near her apartment. Nothing fancy, but the food was good. She would lead the way. The restaurant was indeed small, tucked into a corner with red checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles. They ordered pasta and ate in comfortable silence for a while. The tension from earlier was dissipated by the shared experience of seeing their daughter for the first time. Finally, Isabella set down her fork and looked at Dominic across the table. She said she'd been thinking about what he said about getting a safer apartment, and she'd like to take him up on that offer. She took a breath. She said it wasn't because she was giving in or letting him control things, but because he was right. The neighborhood wasn't safe for a woman alone with a baby, and she needed to start thinking about what was best for her, not just her pride. Relief flooded through Dominic. He said they could start looking this week, wherever she wanted. Isabella twisted her napkin between her fingers. She said she'd like something near the new doctor's office, a building with security and an elevator. And she wanted him to understand something. This didn't mean they were back together. It didn't mean she'd forgiven everything, or that she was ready to jump back into a relationship. He said he understood. She said she was doing this for their daughter, because she deserved a safe home and a father who was present. But they needed time. They needed to rebuild trust before they could be anything more than co-parents. Dominic said quietly that's what they would do. However long it took, he would prove himself worthy of her trust again. She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for signs of deception or impatience. Whatever she saw there must have reassured her, because she nodded slowly. She said, "Okay, let's try this. Co-parents working towards something more." But she warned him, if he hurt her again, if he made her regret giving him this chance, she was gone. And this time, he wouldn't find her. The threat was clear, delivered with quiet conviction, and Dominic believed every word. He promised he wouldn't hurt her again, and gave her his word. It was a start, fragile, tentative, but real. And as they finished dinner, and Dominic drove Isabella back to her apartment, he felt hope beginning to bloom in his chest. He'd found her. She was giving him a chance, and in 3.5 months, he would hold his daughter for the first time. The future was still uncertain, still scarred by past mistakes. But for the first time in months, Dominic believed they might actually make it through. The next 3 weeks unfolded with careful deliberation. Each day was a delicate dance between Dominic's determination to prove himself and Isabella's cautious willingness to let him try. He kept his word about finding her a better apartment. He spent an entire Saturday driving her through neighborhoods on Chicago's North Side until she fell in love with a 2-bedroom unit in a pre-war building with actual security guards and an elevator that didn't shake ominously between floors. Isabella had protested that it was too much when she saw the spacious living room with windows overlooking a tree-lined street. She told Dominic she didn't need something this nice. He had moved to stand beside her at the window, careful to maintain the physical distance Isabella still needed. He said their daughter did. She deserved a safe neighborhood and a room of her own. Besides, there was space for a nursery here. The second bedroom got morning light, perfect for a baby. Isabella had pressed her hand against the window glass, her reflection showing the internal struggle playing across her face. She told him he was making this very hard to say no to. Dominic had allowed himself a small smile. He said that was the idea, but if she really hated it, they would keep looking. This was her choice. He was just providing options. She'd signed the lease that afternoon. Dominic handled the financial arrangements while Isabella maintained legal control, exactly as he'd promised. The moving process was swift. Isabella had accumulated very little during her months in hiding, and Dominic hired professional movers who had her settled within 2 days. He bought furniture for the nursery without asking permission, a decision that sparked their first real argument in the new apartment. She said he couldn't just make decisions like this without consulting her. standing in the doorway of the second bedroom while delivery men assembled a white crib that probably cost more than her first car. She said this was exactly the kind of controlling behavior she was afraid of. Dominic had been reviewing contracts on his laptop in the living room. He closed it carefully and stood, moving to where Isabella watched the assembly with crossed arms and fire in her eyes. He said she was right, that he should have asked first. He apologized. The quick capitulation seemed to surprise her. She asked if that was it. No argument about how he was just trying to help. He admitted he was trying to help, but that didn't excuse making unilateral decisions about their daughter's nursery. Dominic gestured toward the furniture. He said if she hated it, he'd have it returned, and they would pick something out together. It was her choice. Isabella studied the crib, the matching changing table, the rocking chair positioned near the window. Her expression softened slightly. She said it was beautiful, but that wasn't the point. He said he knew the point was respect and partnership. Dominic moved closer but stopped when he saw her tense. He explained he was still learning how to do this, how to be present without being overwhelming, how to help without controlling. He knew he was going to make mistakes. She said she needed him to ask her first about everything involving the baby. They would make decisions together or not at all. He agreed. He meant it. The empire Dominic had built required absolute control, unquestioned authority. But this, Isabella, their daughter, the family he was desperately trying to build, this required something different. It required him to share power instead of wielding it. The adjustment was harder than he'd anticipated. But every time Dominic felt the urge to simply handle something himself, to make the efficient decision and present it as fate, he forced himself to stop, to call Isabella, to ask rather than tell. What color should we paint the nursery? Did she prefer the pediatrician on the north side or the one downtown? Should they register for baby supplies now or wait until after the shower? Isabella's mother was insisting on throwing. Each question was a small surrender of control. Each conversation was Dominic proving he could be a partner instead of a commander. Isabella noticed. He could see the gradual softening in her eyes, the way her shoulders relaxed, incrementally when he arrived for their now regular dinner dates. They weren't romantic. Isabella had been clear about maintaining boundaries, but they were comfortable, easy in ways their stolen moments in New York had never been. Dominic would ask her to tell him about her day, and Isabella would talk about the prenatal yoga class she'd started attending, or the book she was reading about infant development, or the way the baby had kicked during a particularly loud thunderstorm. In return, Dominic told her about the business he was slowly restructuring to allow more remote work, about Marco's bewilderment at seeing his ruthless boss take paternity leave preparation seriously, about the conversation with Vincent Moretti, where the old man had laughed and said, "Welcome to the club of men who thought they were too smart for love. They were building something new, something fragile, but real." Then came the night everything changed. Dominic was in his Chicago apartment. He'd finally rented one rather than living in hotels. His phone rang at 11 p.m. Isabella's name on the screen sent his heart racing immediately. She never called this late. He answered, already grabbing his keys, asking what was wrong. Her voice was tight with controlled panic. She said she didn't know if anything was wrong, but she was bleeding. Not a lot, but enough that she was scared. And the doctor's office wouldn't open until morning. And she knew she was probably overreacting, but he told her he was coming right now and not to move. Dominic was already in the hallway, taking the stairs because waiting for the elevator was impossible. He asked if she'd called an ambulance. She said no, she didn't want to. He told her to call 911 and that he'd meet her at the hospital. He burst out onto the street, flagging down a taxi with the kind of authority that made the driver stop immediately. He told her to hang up and call for help and to promise him she would. She said okay, she would. The line went dead. Dominic gave the driver Isabella's address and a $100 bill, promising another $100 if they got there in under 5 minutes. The taxi wove through late-night traffic with reckless speed while Dominic's mind raced through terrible possibilities. Bleeding during pregnancy could mean anything from minor complications to catastrophic loss. He couldn't lose their daughter, couldn't lose the future he just started to believe was possible. The ambulance was already outside Isabella's building when Dominic arrived. He took the stairs 3 at a time, bursting into her apartment to find paramedics checking her vital signs while she sat on the couch looking small and terrified. She called his name and reached for him. He was at her side instantly, taking her hand and pressing it against his chest. He told her he was here, that he'd got her. He looked at the paramedics and asked what was happening. The older of the two said her vitals were stable. Some spotting, which could be normal at this stage, but should be checked out. They were taking her to Northwestern Memorial to be safe. Dominic said he was riding with her. No one argued. Within minutes, they were in the ambulance. Isabella was on the gurney while Dominic sat beside her, holding her hand like it was the only thing anchoring him to earth. Her fingers were ice cold despite the warm night, trembling against his palm. She whispered that the baby was moving earlier. She'd felt her kicking during dinner, but now she was so quiet. Dominic pressed his lips to her knuckles and told her not to go there. They were going to the hospital. They were going to check everything, and their daughter was going to be fine. She said he didn't know that. He replied that he knew she was strong and the baby was strong, and they were going to get through this together. He met her eyes, willing her to believe him. He told her she wasn't alone anymore. Whatever happened, she wasn't facing it alone. The emergency room at Northwestern Memorial was controlled chaos. Nurses moving with efficient urgency, doctors consulting in low voices, the constant beep of monitors creating an anxious symphony. Isabella was taken immediately to an examination room, while Dominic was directed to wait outside. He paced the hallway like a caged animal, his mind supplying increasingly horrific scenarios. This was his fault. The stress of their separation, of Isabella living in that terrible apartment for months, of her working herself to exhaustion to maintain independence. All of it had taken a toll, and now their daughter might pay the price for Dominic's mistakes. A doctor emerged from Isabella's room, her expression professionally neutral. She told Mr. Castellano he could come in now. Dominic was through the door before she finished speaking. Isabella lay on the hospital bed, hooked up to monitors, her face pale but no longer panicked. And on the screen beside her, a steady heartbeat pulsed with reassuring rhythm. Dominic managed to ask about the baby. The doctor said with a gentle smile that she was fine. Her heartbeat was strong and steady. The bleeding was caused by a minor placental irritation. Nothing serious, but it needed monitoring. She recommended reduced activity for the next week, and a follow-up appointment with her OB relief hit Dominic so hard he had to grip the bed rail to stay upright. She was okay. They were both okay. Isabella confirmed they were both okay, tears streaming down her face. She told Dominic the baby started kicking again right after they did the ultrasound, like she was saying she was still here. He moved to her side, careful of the IV line and monitors, and gathered her into his arms as much as the equipment allowed. Isabella buried her face in his shoulder and sobbed. Great heaving cries of relief and residual fear that soaked through his shirt. He murmured into her hair that he'd got her, that he'd got them both, and that they were safe. They stayed like that until Isabella's tears subsided, and the doctor returned with discharge instructions. Bed rest for 3 days, minimal activity for a week after that, and immediate return to the hospital if any bleeding resumed. The doctor also recommended having someone stay with Isabella to monitor her condition. Dominic said he would stay before Isabella could protest. He would sleep on the couch. She wouldn't even know he was there. Isabella looked like she wanted to argue, but exhaustion and lingering fear won out. She said, okay, just for tonight. But one night became 2, then 3, then a week. Dominic took over cooking duties, producing surprisingly competent meals from Isabella's small kitchen. He worked from his laptop at her dining table, taking calls in the hallway when they required privacy. He maintained the careful physical distance Isabella still needed, while being constantly available if she needed anything. On the 4th morning, Isabella emerged from her bedroom to find Dominic already in the kitchen making breakfast. He'd started keeping groceries at her apartment. Healthy foods the pregnancy books recommended. This morning, it was scrambled eggs with vegetables and whole grain toast. She said he didn't have to keep doing this, settling onto the couch with a hand pressed to her lower back. She was feeling better. He could go back to his apartment. Dominic plated the eggs and brought them to her, along with the prenatal vitamins she was supposed to take with meals. He asked if she wanted him to leave. She said that's not what she said. He replied that he was staying. He sat in the armchair across from her, maintaining that careful distance. He told her that when he got her call that night, when he thought something might be wrong with her or the baby, he realized something. He didn't want to be the father who shows up for scheduled visits and important appointments. He wanted to be present for the mundane moments too, for breakfast and bedtime and everything in between. Isabella set down her fork, studying him with an intensity that made Dominic feel transparent. She realized he was asking to move in. He said he was asking for a chance to be the partner she deserved. Not just the father of her child, but the man who's there when she can't sleep because the baby's kicking her ribs. The one who makes her tea when her back hurts and assembles ridiculous amounts of baby furniture and learns how to install car seats properly. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He was asking for more than co-parenting. He was asking for a real chance at building a life together. She reminded him they tried that once, and it didn't work out. He said they tried it in secret, in stolen moments, with him too afraid to admit what she meant to him. Dominic's voice was steady despite the fear churning in his gut. He asked her to let him try again. The right way this time, open and honest with no more walls between them. Isabella looked away, her hand moving unconsciously to her stomach where their daughter grew stronger every day. She admitted she was still angry at him, still hurt. He said he knew. She said she didn't know if she could trust that he wouldn't revert to the man who saw children as liabilities the moment things get difficult. He told her to let him prove it. Dominic waited until she met his eyes again. He asked for 6 weeks, until the baby came. Let him show her through actions instead of words that he'd changed, that he wanted this family more than anything else in his life. The question hurt, but Dominic forced himself to answer honestly when she asked what would happen if she still didn't trust him after 6 weeks. He said then he would move out. He would be the best co-parent he could possibly be, but he would respect her boundaries. He wouldn't push for more than she was willing to give. Isabella was silent for a long time, her breakfast growing cold on the plate. Finally, she said he could sleep on the couch. They would maintain separate spaces, and if she said she needed time alone, he would give it to her without argument. Hope bloomed in Dominic's chest. He agreed. She clarified this wasn't her saying they were back together. This was a trial run. Her seeing if the man he was showing her now was real or just a performance that will fade once the novelty wears off. He said he understood. Isabella took a shaky breath. She agreed to do 6 weeks, but she warned him that if he hurt her again, if he made her regret this, she would make sure he regretted it more. She had signed documents giving her full custody, and she would use them. The threat would have terrified him once. Now, it just made Dominic love her more for the fierce protectiveness she showed their daughter. He promised she wouldn't need to. Over the next weeks, they settled into a rhythm that felt almost domestic. Dominic moved his essential belongings into Isabella's second bedroom, now converted to a nursery and makeshift office. He structured his days around her needs. Morning coffee ready when she woke up. Lunch prepared with the precise nutritional balance her pregnancy required. Evenings were spent assembling baby equipment while Isabella read aloud from parenting books that made them both laugh and panic in equal measure. One night, Isabella was reading from a book about infant development. She said that a baby will wake every 2 to 3 hours for feeding, resulting in severe sleep deprivation for both parents. Every 2 to 3 hours for months. Dominic looked up from the complicated instruction manual for a bottle sterilizer. He said they would take shifts. She would feed, and he would handle diaper changes and getting her back to sleep. She reminded him he had a business empire to run, that he couldn't function on no sleep. He replied he would function on whatever sleep he got. He told her he wasn't helping her with this baby, he was raising her with her. Equal partners, equal responsibility. He abandoned the sterilizer, which he was beginning to suspect was designed by sadists, and moved to sit beside her on the couch. Besides, Marco's been running things in New York with minimal input from him for weeks now. Either he's proven he can handle more autonomy, or he'd been deluding himself about how essential he was to daily operations. Isabella teased that the great Dominic Castellano was admitting he might not be indispensable. The world must be ending. He said his world already ended. Then it started again the day he realized she was pregnant. Dominic carefully took her hand, the gesture still tentative despite weeks of cohabitation. He told her everything he built before was just preparation for this, for her, for their daughter. Isabella's fingers tightened around his. They sat like that in comfortable silence, the Chicago skyline glittering through the windows while their daughter kicked against Isabella's ribs with increasing vigor. Isabella murmured that she was so active tonight and told him to feel. She guided Dominic's hand to her stomach, pressing his palm against the spot where their daughter was staging what felt like an acrobatic performance. The movement beneath his fingers was strong and insistent, tiny feet or fists pushing against the boundaries of Isabella's womb. Dominic said with awe in his voice that she was a fighter, just like her mother. Isabella joked that she hoped she had his strategic mind and her common sense, otherwise they were in trouble. Dominic added that he hoped she had her compassion and his protective instincts, then she would be unstoppable. Isabella laughed, the sound genuine and unguarded. Over the past weeks, Dominic had been cataloging every small victory. Each moment when Isabella's walls lowered incrementally, when she let him see the woman who'd fallen in love with him in stolen moments behind closed doors. This laughter felt like a breakthrough. Isabella said suddenly she'd been thinking about names, if he wanted to discuss it. He replied he absolutely wanted to discuss it. Dominic would have discussed paint drying if it meant these moments of peaceful domesticity continued. He asked what she was considering. She said she liked Sophia because it meant wisdom. Isabella's hand covered his where it still rested on her stomach, and maybe Rose for a middle name, after his mother. The suggestion hit Dominic like a physical blow. His mother, dead for 27 years, killed by the violence that defined their world, never gotten to meet her grandchildren, had died believing her son would follow his father into an early grave, consumed by the same empire that had destroyed them both. His voice was rough with emotion as he said that she remembered her name. Isabella turned to face him fully, her expression soft. She said he'd told her about her once, late at night after he'd had too much whiskey and his guard was down. She said his mother used to garden, that she kept roses, despite his father saying they were frivolous, that she'd smell like flowers and earth when she kissed him goodnight. Dominic had forgotten telling Isabella that story, had forgotten the vulnerability of those whiskey-soaked confessions. But she'd remembered, had carried the memory of his mother through all the pain and separation, and now she was offering to honor that memory by giving their daughter Rose as a middle name. Dominic tested the name. Sophia Rose Castellano. He felt it settle over his heart like a benediction. It was perfect. Isabella tentatively suggested they could hyphenate Sophia Rose Romano Castellano to give her both their names. He said he'd like that. Dominic pressed his forehead to Isabella's, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and the underlying sweetness that was uniquely hers. He thanked her for remembering, for honoring her. She said she was his mother. She made him who he was. Their daughter should carry that legacy. They stayed close for a moment longer, the space between them charged with something that felt like hope. Then Isabella pulled back slightly, her expression turning serious. She said she needed to ask him something, and she needed him to be completely honest. He said anything. She asked what would happen when they went back to New York, when real life started again, and he was pulled back into the business. Isabella's eyes searched his face. She pointed out that right now he was playing house with her in Chicago, but his empire was in Manhattan. His responsibilities were there. She asked how this would work when geography and business demands pulled them apart. It was the question Dominic had been anticipating and dreading in equal measure. The answer required vulnerability he still wasn't comfortable with, required admitting truths he'd spent decades denying. He said carefully that he was restructuring the business. Marco had been training to take over day-to-day operations for months now, even before he found her. He admitted he was already tired of the violence and the constant vigilance and the weight of maintaining an empire built on fear. She realized he was planning to step back. He said he was planning to transition into a different role, advisory rather than operational. He'd still be involved, still maintain control over major decisions, but the daily grind, the meetings and negotiations and territorial disputes, Marco could handle that. Dominic took both her hands in his. He said he wanted to be present for their daughter's life, for her life. That meant putting family first instead of business. Isabella looked skeptical. She said men like him don't just walk away from power. He explained as he wasn't walking away, he was reprioritizing. He squeezed her hands gently. His father died because he couldn't separate his business from his family. He couldn't see that protecting one sometimes meant compromising the other. He said he wouldn't make that mistake. Sophia deserved a father who was alive and present, not one who was so consumed by empire building that he missed her childhood. She asked if he thought Marco was ready for that kind of responsibility. He said he thought Marco had been ready for years. He was just too controlling to admit it. Dominic's smile was self-deprecating. It turned out learning to delegate started with trusting his second-in-command to handle things without his constant oversight. Isabella studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing his words against his past actions. She asked when he was planning to tell her about this restructuring. He said tonight, actually. He wanted to have concrete plans in place first, not just vague intentions. Dominic released one of her hands to pull a folder from his laptop bag. He explained these were the transition documents. Marco would take over as CEO effective 2 months from now. He would become chairman of the board, still involved in major decisions, but not responsible for daily operations. Isabella took the folder, paging through the legal documents with widening eyes. She couldn't believe this was really happening, that he was actually stepping back. He said it was for her, for Sophia, for the life he wanted them to build together. Dominic watched her read, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew it didn't erase the past. It didn't make up for the months she spent alone and afraid. But he was trying to show her through actions that he meant what he said. That she and their daughter were the most important things in his world. Isabella closed the folder carefully, her hands trembling slightly. She said she didn't know what to say. He asked her to say she would come back to New York with him when Sophia was born, that they would raise her together in the same city, in the same home. Dominic knew he was pushing, knew Isabella had asked for time, and he was demanding decisions. But the 6 weeks she'd given him were ticking down, and he needed to know if there was a future beyond this temporary arrangement. He asked her to say she would give them a real chance. Not as co-parents maintaining separate lives, but as partners building a family together. She replied that he was asking her to trust him completely, to uproot her life again and move back to the city, where everything fell apart. He said he was asking her to trust that he'd learned from his mistakes, that the man standing in front of her now understood what was important. Dominic cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing across her cheekbones. He told her he loved her. He said he had loved her since she walked into his office with fire in her eyes and refused to be intimidated, and he would spend every day for the rest of his life proving that love was real. Tears spilled down Isabella's cheeks, but her eyes were searching his face with desperate hope rather than fear. She said she wanted to believe him, so badly it scared her. He told her to take the leap, to trust him one more time. His voice dropped to a whisper as he promised he wouldn't let her fall. Isabella was quiet for so long, Dominic thought she might refuse. His heart was breaking in slow motion, preparing for the rejection he'd earned through months of careless cruelty. Then she spoke, her voice steady despite the tears. She said, okay. When Sophia was born, they would go back to New York together. They would try to build a real life, a real family. She placed her hand over his heart, feeling it pound beneath her palm. But she warned him, this was his last chance. If he broke her heart again, if he made her regret trusting him, she was gone for good. Signed documents or not, she would find a way to disappear that even his resources couldn't track. He promised she wouldn't need to, and swore it. Dominic pressed his lips to her forehead, breathing her in. He thanked her for giving him this chance, for being brave enough to trust again. They held each other as the city lights flickered outside, and their daughter moved between them. A reminder of everything they had to lose, and everything they might gain. The road ahead was still uncertain, still fraught with the potential for heartbreak. But for the first time since Isabella had disappeared from his life, Dominic believed they might actually make it. The next morning, Isabella woke to find Dominic in the kitchen making pancakes shaped like hearts. It was ridiculously sentimental, completely unlike the ruthless businessman she'd first met, and absolutely perfect. She accused him of trying to bribe her with breakfast food as she settled onto a bar stool, her hand pressed to her aching back. Dominic slid a plate in front of her and asked if it was working. The pancakes were perfectly golden and accompanied by fresh fruit. She admitted that unfortunately, yes, it was. Isabella cut into a pancake, the fluffy texture melting on her tongue. She asked where he learned to cook like this. He said mostly YouTube, and several panicked phone calls to Marco's wife, who thought it was hilarious that he was domesticating. Dominic poured her orange juice with the same precision he'd once applied to hostile takeovers. He said he was a fast learner when properly motivated. She asked if she was proper motivation. He replied that she and Sophia were the only motivation he needed. They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, the morning sun streaming through the windows and painting everything in shades of gold. This was what Isabella had dreamed of during those long months alone. Simple domestic moments, shared meals, the quiet intimacy of building a life together. She was still terrified it might all fall apart, still waiting for Dominic to revert to the cold, calculating man who declared children liabilities. But every day he showed up, every small gesture of care and consideration chipped away at her fear. Maybe, just maybe, they could actually make this work. Dominic interrupted her thoughts, saying he had a meeting this afternoon, a video conference with Marco about the transition timeline. He asked if she needed anything before he was tied up for a few hours. She said she was fine. Actually, she was thinking about going for a walk. The doctor said light exercise was good as long as she didn't overdo it. Dominic's expression immediately shifted to concern. He said he would come with her. She reminded him he had a meeting. He replied that Marco could wait. Her safety was more important. Isabella felt warmth bloom in her chest at the casual way he prioritized her over business. The old Dominic would have sent her with a bodyguard and thought nothing more of it. This version canceled meetings and rearranged his schedule without hesitation. She said softly, "Okay, a walk sounds nice." They strolled through the neighborhood hand in hand, Dominic matching his pace to Isabella's slower gait. She pointed out her favorite shops, the coffee place with the best decaf lattes, the bookstore where she'd spent hours browsing parenting guides. Dominic listened and asked questions and committed every detail to memory, like her preferences were strategic intelligence worth safeguarding. As they made their way back to the apartment, Isabella thanked him for being here, for trying so hard. Dominic stopped on the sidewalk, turning to face her fully. He said he wasn't trying. This was who he was now, who he wanted to be for her, for Sophia, for the family they were building. And standing there in the afternoon sunshine with her hand in his, and their daughter moving beneath her heart, Isabella finally let herself believe him. The weeks that followed carried a fragile peace that Isabella guarded carefully, still half expecting it to shatter. But Dominic remained constant, present, during the 3-amp leg cramps that woke her crying, patient when pregnancy hormones made her snap at him over insignificant details, and unfailingly gentle when fear crept in during the quiet hours. At 36 weeks, Isabella's body began preparing for labor with increasing urgency. Braxton Hicks' contractions came and went with uncomfortable regularity, each one sending Dominic into barely contained panic until Isabella assured him it was normal. Her ankles swelled despite keeping them elevated. Sleep became nearly impossible with Sophia performing acrobatics against her ribs. Through it all, Dominic adapted. He researched pregnancy complications with the same intensity he'd once applied to hostile takeovers. He memorized warning signs that required immediate medical attention and kept the hospital bag packed and ready by the door with military precision. One afternoon, Isabella caught him watching her from across the room with that expression of controlled worry he couldn't quite hide. She told him he was hovering again. He corrected her, saying he was observing and that there was a difference. She said he'd been observing her sleep for the past hour, and that was hovering. He explained that she made small distress sounds when she slept now, and he was making sure she was comfortable. Isabella's irritation melted despite herself. She told him she was fine, the baby was fine, and he needed to relax before he gave himself an ulcer. He replied he would relax when Sophia was here, and they were both healthy. Dominic moved to sit beside her on the couch, his hand finding her swollen belly with the familiarity of practice. He asked if that was so unreasonable. She admitted it was sweet, but also slightly neurotic. Isabella covered his hand with hers, feeling Sophia kick against their joined palms. But she appreciated the concern, even when it drove her crazy. He said he couldn't help it. Every time he thought about her going through labor, about all the things that could go wrong, he stopped, his jaw tightening. He said he could face down armed men without flinching, but the thought of her in pain, of something happening to either of them, terrified him in ways he didn't know were possible. The raw admission settled between them. Isabella had been watching Dominic carefully over these weeks, cataloging the small ways he'd changed. But this vulnerability, this admission of fear from a man who'd built an empire on appearing invincible, this felt significant. She quietly admitted she was scared too, terrified actually, but they were doing this together, and that had to count for something. He said it counted for everything. Dominic pressed his lips to her temple, the gesture tender. He told her he loved her. He knew he'd said it before, but he needed her to understand. He had never loved anything or anyone the way he loved her and Sophia. They were his entire world. Isabella turned to face him fully, studying the sincerity in his dark eyes. Over the past weeks, she'd felt her resistance crumbling incrementally. The walls she'd built to protect her heart were wearing thin under the constant assault of Dominic's devotion. She was falling in love with him all over again, or perhaps admitting she'd never truly stopped. She whispered that she loved him too. The words were both terrifying and liberating. She said she'd been fighting it, trying to protect herself, but she couldn't anymore. She loved him, Dominic, completely and terrifyingly. The kiss was inevitable, a slow meeting of lips that carried months of longing and fear and hope. Dominic cupped her face like she was something precious and fragile, kissing her with a reverence that made tears sting behind Isabella's closed eyes. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. He murmured against her lips that he'd missed this, missed her. She said she'd missed him too. Even when she was furious at him, even when she was convinced she should hate him, she missed this. Isabella rested her forehead against his. She asked him to promise her something. He said anything. She asked him to promise that when things got hard, and they would get hard with a newborn and sleep deprivation and all the challenges they couldn't predict, he wouldn't shut her out, that he would talk to her instead of making decisions alone. His voice was fierce with conviction. He promised. No more secrets. No more walls. They would face everything together. They sealed the promise with another kiss, this one deeper, more certain. And for the first time since hearing those devastating words outside Dominic's office, Isabella allowed herself to believe in the future they were building. The belief was tested 2 days later when Isabella woke at 4 a.m. with contractions that felt different from the practice ones she'd been experiencing. These were lower, sharper, coming with concerning regularity. She lay still for several minutes, timing them with the app on her phone before gently shaking Dominic awake. She said she thought this was it, real labor. The contractions were 7 minutes apart. Dominic was instantly alert, the grogginess vanishing from his eyes as he shifted into crisis mode. He asked how long she'd been timing them. She said about 40 minutes. He asked why she didn't wake him sooner. He was already moving, pulling on clothes with efficient speed. She explained it was because she wasn't sure, and she didn't want to alarm him if it was false labor. Another contraction gripped her abdomen, stronger than before, and Isabella breathed through it with the techniques they'd learned in birthing class. But these felt real, very real. Dominic had the hospital bag in hand before the contraction ended. He asked if she could walk. She retorted that she was pregnant, not paralyzed. Isabella let him help her stand anyway, grateful for his steadying presence as another contraction hit. He said they should call the doctor. She said she was already texting her. Dominic kept one arm around Isabella while typing on his phone with the other, multitasking with the focus she remembered from watching him manage business crises. The doctor said to head to the hospital when contractions were 5 minutes apart, or if her water broke. He decided they were close enough that they should go now. The drive to Northwestern Memorial was surreal. Chicago streets were nearly empty at this hour. Streetlights cast orange pools across the pavement, while Isabella breathed through contractions that were intensifying with alarming speed. Dominic drove with careful control, one hand on the wheel and the other clasping Isabella's, his thumb rubbing soothing circles against her palm. He murmured that she was doing great during a particularly intense contraction. He told her to just keep breathing. They were almost there. Isabella gasped when the contraction finally released its grip. She said this hurt so much more than the book said it would. He told her they could get her the epidural as soon as they arrived, whatever she needed for the pain. She said she wanted to try without it first, to see how far she could get. He told her she didn't have to prove anything. If she was in pain, there was no shame in asking for relief. She loved him for saying it without judgment, for not pushing his own agenda about how labor should proceed. She decided to just see how it went. She would decide when they got there. The hospital staff was expecting them. Dominic had called ahead while Isabella was getting dressed, ensuring everything would be ready for their arrival. They were taken immediately to a labor and delivery room where a nurse checked Isabella's progression with practiced efficiency. The nurse announced with an encouraging smile that she was at 5 centimeters already, moving right along. She asked if it was her first baby. Isabella managed to say yes between contractions. The nurse said she was doing wonderfully, and they would get her comfortable and monitor the baby's heartbeat, while she decided about pain management. The next hours blurred into a haze of intensifying contractions, Dominic's steady presence beside the bed, and the constant monitoring of Sophia's heartbeat through the fetal monitor. Isabella tried to manage the pain through breathing techniques and position changes, but by 8 centimeters, she was ready to admit defeat. She told Dominic through gritted teeth that she wanted the epidural. Right now, please. He said he would get the nurse. He was gone and back within seconds, and the anesthesiologist arrived shortly after to administer the blessed relief of pain medication. Isabella felt guilty for caving. Some irrational part of her brain insisted she should have been stronger, but Dominic would hear none of it. He said firmly that she'd been in labor for 6 hours, and she was about to push a whole human being out of her body. He wiped her forehead with a cool cloth. He told her she was the strongest person he'd ever met, and taking medication didn't change that. Isabella whispered that she loved him, the words made easier by exhaustion and the fading pain. He said he loved her too, so much. Dominic kissed her forehead. He told her she was almost there. Soon they would meet their daughter. The epidural brought enough relief that Isabella could focus on something besides the pain. She watched Dominic move around the room with contained energy, adjusting her pillows, bringing ice chips when she asked, speaking in low tones with the medical staff. This was a side of him few people ever saw, the caretaker beneath the commander, the gentle man hidden behind the ruthless businessman. At one point, the nurse told Mr. Castellano he might want to eat something. She said labor could take a while from here, and he would need his strength for the pushing phase. Dominic's tone made it clear this wasn't negotiable. He said he wasn't leaving. The nurse mentioned a cafeteria on the second floor. He repeated that he wasn't leaving. He softened his voice slightly. He thanked her for the concern, but he was staying right here until his daughter was born. The nurse wisely didn't push further. Isabella reached for Dominic's hand, squeezing it gratefully. She told him he should eat something, though. She needed him functional, not passed out on the floor. He said he would eat after Sophia arrived. He insisted he had faced down hostile takeovers and territorial disputes without food or sleep. He could handle a few more hours. His expression was resolute. He told her he wasn't leaving her side, not for anything. She didn't have the energy to argue, and truthfully, she didn't want him to leave. Having Dominic there, solid and steady, and completely focused on her, made the terrifying process of labor slightly less overwhelming. At 10 centimeters, the doctor arrived with the news Isabella had been simultaneously dreading and anticipating. She was fully dilated. It was time to start pushing. Terror spiked through Isabella's exhaustion. This was it. After months of preparation and planning and fear, she was about to meet her daughter. Their daughter. The tiny life they'd created was about to enter the world, and nothing would ever be the same. She admitted to Dominic she was scared, gripping his hand hard enough to hurt. He said he knew that he was terrified too. He pressed his lips to her knuckles. But they were doing this together. Her, him, and Sophia. They were ready for this. She wondered if she couldn't do this. His eyes were fierce with conviction. He said she could. She was the bravest person he knew. He reminded her she disappeared into hiding, pregnant and alone, because she thought it was best for their daughter. She built a life from nothing in a strange city. She gave him a second chance even after he'd broken her heart. He told her if she could do all that, she could absolutely do this. The doctor interrupted their moment. She told Isabella that with the next contraction, she needed her to push. She told Dominic to support her back and count to 10. The pushing phase was brutal. Despite the epidural, it was an exhausting marathon that required every ounce of strength Isabella had left. Dominic counted through each push, his voice steady and encouraging, even as Isabella crushed his hand and screamed through the effort. Time lost meaning. The world narrowed to the doctor's instructions, Dominic's counting, and the overwhelming need to bring their daughter safely into the world. The doctor announced she could see the head. One more big push, Isabella. She was almost there. Isabella bore down with everything she had left. Dominic's voice was in her ear, telling her he loved her, that she was amazing, just one more. She could do this. And then suddenly, the pressure released, and a cry filled the room. Not her own cry, but something smaller, angrier, absolutely perfect. The doctor announced unnecessarily that it was a girl, placing a tiny, squirming, beautiful creature on Isabella's chest. Sophia Rose Romano Castellano had arrived. Isabella stared at her daughter through tears that blurred everything into impressionistic smears of color and light. Sophia was perfect, all pink skin and dark hair, and impossibly tiny fingers that grasped at air. Her cry was strong and indignant, letting the world know she'd arrived, and was not particularly happy about the transition. Isabella whispered, her voice breaking, "Hello, baby girl. Hello, Sophia. We've been waiting for you." Beside her, Dominic was completely undone. Tears streamed down his face as he stared at his daughter, one hand gently touching her impossibly small head, while the other still held Isabella's. He said she was perfect, absolutely perfect. The doctor asked if he would like to cut the cord. Dominic looked to Isabella for permission. She nodded, and he moved to perform the task with hands that trembled slightly. When it was done, he returned to Isabella's side, leaning down to kiss her forehead with reverence. He whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for her. Thank you for giving him this chance. Thank you for being so incredibly strong." The next hour passed in a blur of newborn tests and measurements, while Isabella delivered the placenta and the medical team ensured both mother and baby were healthy. Sophia weighed 6 pounds 9 ounces and measured 19 inches long. Her APGAR scores were excellent. She was, according to every metric the doctors could measure, absolutely perfect. Finally cleaned and swaddled, Sophia was returned to Isabella's arms. Dominic settled carefully onto the bed beside them, creating a small family cocoon in the hospital room while Chicago woke up outside their window. Sophia had stopped crying, her dark blue eyes struggling to focus on the faces above her. Isabella observed that she had his nose, tracing one finger along Sophia's tiny features, and his chin, his beautiful mouth. Dominic touched their daughter with the same reverence he'd shown Isabella, like Sophia was made of spun glass and might shatter under careless handling. He couldn't believe she was real, that they made this perfect little person. Isabella asked softly if he was glad. Truly glad with no regrets. Dominic turned to look at her fully, his eyes still wet with tears. He said this was the best moment of his entire life. Every choice he made, every path he took, every mistaken triumph, all of it led here to her and Sophia. How could he possibly regret any of it? Even the months he was gone, even the pain of searching, even that, because it taught him what mattered. It taught him that all the power and money in the world means nothing without people to share it with. He kissed Isabella jostled gently, careful not to jostle their daughter. He loved them both so much it terrified him, but he wouldn't trade this terror for anything. A knock interrupted the moment. The nurse poked her head in with an apologetic smile. She was sorry to disturb, but there was a gentleman outside who was very insistent about seeing Mr. Castellano. She said his name was Marco. Dominic's eyebrows rose. He was surprised Marco was there. The nurse said apparently he flew in this morning when he got Dominic's text about the baby. She asked if she should send him away. Dominic looked to Isabella, who was too exhausted and happy to care about visitors. She said, of course, let him in. Marco entered cautiously, a massive bouquet of flowers in his arms and uncertainty written across his usually confident features. He hoped this wasn't intrusive. He just wanted to. He stopped dead when he saw Dominic on the bed with Isabella, both of them holding the newborn. He exclaimed, "Holy hell, that's a baby. An actual baby." Dominic said dryly that he was very observant, but his smile was genuine. He introduced Marco to Sofia Rose Romano Castellano and told Sofia this was her uncle Marco, who was going to spoil her absolutely rotten. Marco set down the flowers and approached slowly, peering at Sofia with the weariness of someone who'd never been around infants. He said she was so small and asked if they were supposed to be that small. Isabella assured him she was perfectly normal-sized, amused by his obvious discomfort. Marco awkwardly gestured and asked if it was okay if he held her. Dominic and Isabella exchanged a glance. Finally, Dominic carefully lifted Sofia and placed her in Marco's arms, showing him how to support her head. Marco froze, his expression shifting from uncertain to odd. He said softly that she was perfect. He told his boss she was absolutely perfect. Dominic's voice carried quiet pride. He knew. Marco looked between Dominic and Isabella, something like relief crossing his features. He was glad they worked things out, really glad. The past few months, watching Dominic search for her, watching him fall apart, he stopped, clearly uncomfortable with the emotion. He was just glad they were both here together with this perfect little person. Dominic thanked him for covering things in New York. He knew he'd been absent more than present lately. Marco said it had been good for him, and good for the organization actually. It turned out he was more capable than either of them gave him credit for. Marco gently returned Sofia to Isabella's arms. He told Dominic he meant what he said about the transition. He was ready to take over as CEO. He told him to focus on his family and let him handle the empire. The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. This was Marco releasing Dominic from the burden he'd carried for decades, giving him permission to prioritize family over power. It was a gift of immeasurable value. Dominic said thank you for everything. Marco nodded, an understanding passing between them. He said he would leave them three alone, but told Isabella if she needed anything, and he meant anything, she should call him. He was permanently on Sofia duty. After Marco left, Isabella turned to Dominic with raised eyebrows. Uncle Marco, huh? That was going to be interesting. Dominic said he would be good with her, protective, and he was right. Dominic needed to let go of day-to-day operations. He settled back beside Isabella, one arm around her shoulders, while they both watched Sofia sleep. He said this was more important. They were more important than anything else. They stayed like that for a long time, exhaustion pulling at them both, but neither willing to miss a moment of their daughter's first hours. Finally, Isabella's eyes began to drift closed, despite her best efforts. Dominic urged her gently to sleep. He would watch her. He would wake her when she needed to eat. She said he needed sleep too. He replied he would sleep later. Right now he just wanted to memorize every detail of this moment. He kissed her temple and told her to rest. He had them both. Isabella let her eyes close. Feeling safe in a way she hadn't since before she'd fled New York. Dominic was here. Sofia was here. They were together, a family forged through pain and fear, but stronger for having survived it. When Isabella awoke 3 hours later, she found Dominic exactly where she'd left him. He was sitting beside the bed with Sofia cradled in his arms, watching their daughter sleep with an expression of such profound love that it made Isabella's chest ache. She asked softly if he didn't sleep at all. Dominic looked up, smiling. He said he couldn't, she was too fascinating. He asked if she knew she made these tiny sounds when she dreamed, and her fingers gripped onto his thumb like she was afraid he would disappear if she let go. She was perfect. He agreed she was perfect. He stood carefully and brought Sofia to Isabella. He said she was starting to root and he thought she was hungry. The first attempt at breastfeeding was awkward and frustrating, but eventually Sofia latched on with the determination she'd inherited from both parents. Isabella looked down at her daughter, then up at Dominic, who was watching them both with devotion written across every line of his face. She felt her heart expand with a love so overwhelming it was almost painful. This was everything she'd been afraid to hope for, everything she'd thought she'd lost when she'd overheard those devastating words outside Dominic's office. But they'd fought through the pain and fear and built something real, something lasting. Dominic asked what she was thinking. She said she was glad she gave him another chance, that she was terrified and exhausted, and happier than she'd ever been in her life. Isabella leaned into his warmth. She said they actually did it. They made a family. He agreed they did. Dominic wrapped his arms around both of them, creating a protective circle. And he promised her he would spend every day proving he deserved this, deserved them both. No more mistakes, no more secrets, just them building a life together. Sophia finished eating and promptly fell asleep, milk drunk and content. Isabella handed her to Dominic, who settled their daughter against his chest with the natural ease he'd developed over the past hour. Watching him hold Sophia, this powerful man reduced to tender protectiveness by 6 pounds of newborn, Isabella felt the last of her walls finally crumble. She said quietly that she trusted him completely. She trusted him with their daughter, and with her heart, and with their future. Dominic's eyes met hers, understanding the significance of those words. Trust was the thing Isabella had been withholding, the final barrier between them. Now she was offering it freely, a gift more precious than anything else she could give. He promised he wouldn't waste it. He swore to her he would never give her a reason to regret trusting him. The sun was rising over Chicago now, painting their hospital room in shades of pink and gold. A new day, a new beginning. And curled between them, Sophia Rose slept peacefully, unaware that she'd already changed the world simply by existing. Outside the hospital room, the world continued turning, businesses running, empires expanding, power shifting hands. But inside that small space, nothing else mattered except the three people who'd found each other against impossible odds. A family built from secrets and pain and love strong enough to survive both. A family that would face whatever came next together. They left the hospital 3 days later, stepping into brilliant September sunshine, with Sophia bundled in Dominic's arms like she was made of the most precious materials on earth. Isabella moved carefully beside them, still recovering from labor, but glowing with a happiness that transformed her entire presence. The car Dominic had arranged was waiting at the curb, not the sleek town car he would have chosen months ago, but a sensible SUV with a properly installed infant car seat that he'd researched obsessively. Isabella said she still couldn't believe they just let them leave with her, as Dominic carefully secured Sophia into the car seat with the focused intensity of someone defusing a bomb. She said there was no test, no certification. They just hand you a whole human being and say good luck. Dominic reminded her they'd read 17 books on infant care and watched approximately 40 hours of instructional videos. He said they were as prepared as it was possible to be. She replied, that's what terrified her. They were as prepared as possible, and she still had no idea what she was doing. Dominic finished with the car seat and turned to help Isabella into the front passenger seat, his hand gentle on her elbow. He said, then they would figure it out together, just like everything else. The drive to their Chicago apartment was nerve-wracking. Dominic drove with exaggerated caution, while checking the rearview mirror every 30 seconds to make sure Sophia was still breathing. She slept through the entire journey, completely oblivious to her parents' anxiety. The apartment felt different when they walked through the door. It was the same space they'd been living in for weeks, but transformed by the tiny presence, now entering it for the first time. The nursery was ready, painted a soft sage green with white furniture and a mobile of stars hanging above the crib. Isabella's mother had sent blankets and clothes despite the distance, including a hand-knitted yellow sweater that was currently 2 sizes too large but achingly beautiful. Isabella said softly, home. Sophia was now cradled in her arms. Dominic said carefully that it was their home for now, but they needed to talk about New York. He saw her tense, the old weariness flickering across her features. She asked if they had to talk about it already. Their daughter was only 3 days old. He said he knew, and he wasn't pushing her to leave tomorrow, or even next month, but they needed to make plans. Dominic moved closer, keeping his voice gentle. Marco was taking over as CEO next week. He had properties in New York that needed to be prepared if they were all moving back together. And there were security considerations with Sophie that he couldn't ignore. Isabella sank onto the couch, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. She asked what kind of security considerations. He said the kind that came with being his daughter. Dominic sat beside her, careful not to crowd. He explained he'd made enemies over the years. People who would see Sophia as a weakness to exploit, a way to get to him. In Chicago, they were relatively anonymous. In New York, everyone knew who he was. The moment it became public knowledge that he had a daughter, she became a target. Fear flickered across Isabella's face as she looked down at Sophia, sleeping peacefully in her arms. She hadn't thought about that, about the danger. He said he had, constantly. Dominic reached out to stroke Sophia's downy hair. That's why he'd already arranged for a property that could be secured properly. Not the penthouse, but somewhere with actual outdoor space where Sophia could play safely, a home. Not just an apartment. She asked if he bought a house. He said he had Marco look at several options, but he wanted to wait until she could see them before making a final decision. Dominic pulled out his tablet, bringing up photos of 3 different properties. He said this wasn't him making unilateral choices. This was him presenting options for them to decide together. Isabella studied the photos. A brownstone in the Upper West Side, a townhouse in Brooklyn Heights, and an estate in Westchester with enough land that Sophia could run free without ever leaving the property. All 3 were beautiful, clearly expensive, and completely foreign to the life Isabella had built for herself before Dominic. She said quietly that these were all so much, so far from where she grew up, from anything she knew. He said he knew, and if she hated them all, they would find something else, something that felt right to her. Dominic set the tablet aside, but he needed her to understand he couldn't protect her and Sophia without certain resources. A secure property with trained security staff. Background checks on anyone who came into regular contact with their daughter. Protocols for travel and public appearances. She said he was talking about raising her in a fortress. He was talking about keeping her safe while still giving her as normal a childhood as possible. Dominic's voice carried the weight of old pain. His mother died because his father didn't take security seriously enough, because he thought keeping his family separate from his business was protection enough. He wouldn't make that mistake. Isabella looked at him sharply. She realized he never talked about his mother's death. Not in detail, because it wasn't a memory he revisited willingly. Dominic stood, moving to the window where Chicago sprawled in the distance. But he said she deserved to know. She deserved to understand why he was so adamant about this. He was quiet for a long moment, gathering the words he'd spent decades avoiding. Finally, he spoke. He was 15. His father had just concluded a deal that another family thought should have been theirs. They took his mother from the grocery store parking lot in broad daylight, held her for 3 days while they negotiated terms with his father. Isabella's sharp intake of breath was audible, but Dominic continued, needing to finish now that he'd started. He gave them everything they asked for. Territory, money, public acknowledgement that they'd won. They released his mother, and he thought it was over. He thought paying the price meant they were safe. Isabella whispered that it wasn't over. He confirmed it wasn't over. They'd made their point that his father would sacrifice anything for his family, that they were his weakness. So 2 weeks later, they came for her again. This time, they weren't interested in negotiation. They shot her in our driveway while he watched from his bedroom window. They made sure he saw it. They made sure his father knew that loving someone meant giving your enemies unlimited power over you. Dominic turned back to face Isabella, his expression carefully controlled despite the emotion churning beneath. His father never recovered. He died 6 months later. He threw himself into increasingly reckless situations until one of them killed him. Everyone said it was business as usual, but Dominic knew better. He was looking for death because living without her was unbearable. Tears streamed down Isabella's face. She said she was so sorry. She had no idea. He said he never told her, never told anyone except Marco. He moved back to sit beside her, his voice dropping to something raw and honest. That's why he said those things about children being liabilities. Why he convinced himself he could never have a family. Because he saw what loving someone cost his father, saw what it cost his mother, and he swore he would never give anyone that kind of power over me. She asked what changed his mind. He said he didn't change his mind. He fell in love with her and realized he'd already given her that power, whether he admitted it or not. Dominic cupped her face gently. The day she disappeared, the months he spent searching, the terror when they thought something might be wrong with the pregnancy. He already knew what his father felt. He already understood that loving her meant accepting that losing her would destroy him. Isabella shifted Sophia into one arm so she could reach for Dominic with the other, pulling him close. She told him he wouldn't lose them. She wouldn't let that happen. He said neither would he, which was why he needed her to let him implement proper security. Dominic pressed his forehead to hers, not to control her or limit her freedom, but to make sure that what happened to his mother never happened to her or Sophia. He pleaded with her to let him protect them both properly. Isabella pulled back to look into his eyes, seeing the fear and determination there. This wasn't about power or control. This was about a 15-year-old boy who'd watched his mother die and spent his life trying to prevent that trauma from repeating. How could she deny him the peace of mind that came from knowing his family was protected? She said softly, "Okay, they would do it his way. Security protocols, whatever he thought was necessary." But she made him promise that Sophia got to be a child, that they didn't lock her away from the world because they were afraid of what might happen. He promised she would go to parks and playgrounds and eventually school. She would have friends and birthday parties and all normal childhood experiences, just with trained security, making sure nothing threatened her while she was doing it. Then she said to show her the houses. "Let's pick one together and start planning our move back to New York." Over the next week, they settled into the exhausting rhythm of new parenthood. Sophia woke every 2 hours wanting to eat, her cries piercing the quiet apartment with surprising volume for such a small creature. Isabella handled the feeding while Dominic took over diaper changes and the complicated process of soothing their daughter back to sleep. They were both constantly exhausted, moving through the days in a fog of sleep deprivation that made everything feel slightly surreal. But there was joy in it, too. The way Sophia's tiny hand gripped Dominic's finger, the soft sounds she made while sleeping, the moments when her unfocused eyes seemed to recognize her parents' faces. One morning, Dominic announced that he thought she smiled at him, cradling Sophia against his chest, while Isabella attempted to shower for the first time in 3 days. Isabella called from the bathroom that she was 2 weeks old and that it was probably gas. He insisted it was definitely a smile. She knew her father when she saw him. Isabella emerged wearing one of Dominic's shirts over leggings, her damp hair pulled into a messy bun. She told him he was completely delusional from lack of sleep. He replied maybe, but he was a happy delusional. Dominic looked up from their daughter to smile at Isabella. He asked if he'd mentioned that she was amazing, because she was. Growing her, birthing her, feeding her from her own body. He said she was the most incredible person he'd ever known. Isabella corrected him, saying she was the most exhausted person he'd ever known, but she was smiling and appreciated the sentiment. He said he was serious. He watched her with the baby and was in awe constantly. Dominic stood carefully, bringing Sophia to Isabella. He said she was lucky to have her as her mother. They were both lucky. Isabella took their daughter, settling into the rocking chair they'd placed near the window. She never thought she'd have this. A family. Someone who loved her the way he did. He told her to get used to it. She was stuck with him now. The words were light, but the emotion beneath them was serious. They'd been through fire to get here, months of separation, fear, pain, and slow reconstruction of trust. But they'd emerged stronger for it. Their love tempered into something that could withstand whatever challenges came next. 2 weeks after Sophia's birth, Marco video called with news from New York. His face appeared on Dominic's laptop screen, looking exhausted but satisfied. He announced the transition was complete. He was officially CEO as of this morning. The board had voted unanimously. Dominic congratulated him, bouncing Sophia gently, while Isabella slept on the couch behind him. He said Marco had earned it. Marco thanked him, then corrected himself, saying he guessed he shouldn't call him boss anymore. His expression turned serious. He said there was something else. Vincent Moretti had called. He wanted to arrange a meeting when Dominic was back in New York. He said it was important. Dominic's instincts immediately went on alert. He asked if Vincent said what it was about. Marco said no, but he specifically mentioned bringing his family. He said this concerned all of them. That was unusual. Vincent Moretti didn't make requests lightly, and involving family and business discussions was rare. Dominic told Marco to tell him he'd be in touch once they were settled back in New York. They were planning to move in the next few weeks. Marco added that the Westchester property he was interested in, the owners had accepted his offer. The house was his once he signed the paperwork. Dominic glanced at the sleeping Isabella, remembering the way her eyes had lit up when she'd seen the photos of the Westchester estate. It had space for Sophia to grow, grounds extensive enough to be secured properly, and proximity to excellent schools for the future. They had decided together, spending an entire evening discussing the pros and cons, while Sophia slept between them. Dominic said that was perfect and told Marco to have the lawyers draw up everything. They would sign remotely and arrange the move for next month. After Marco disconnected, Dominic sat quietly holding his daughter while his mind worked through logistics, moving an infant, establishing security protocols, preparing the house, setting up the nursery in their new home. The list of tasks was extensive, but underlying all of it was a thrill of excitement. They were going home, not to his penthouse or Isabella's old apartment, but to a real home they'd chosen together, a place where Sophia could grow up safe and loved. Isabella's sleepy voice came from the couch, asking what he was thinking about so seriously. He said how much he loved her, how perfect their daughter was, how lucky he was that she gave him a second chance. Dominic moved to sit beside her, carefully transferring Sophia to Isabella's arms. He told her Marco had called. The Westchester house was theirs. Isabella's tired face brightened. She asked if they really got it. He confirmed they got it. They could move next month if she was ready. She said she was ready. Isabella looked down at Sophia, then back at Dominic. She was ready to start their life together properly this time. No more secrets. No more hiding. He agreed. No more secrets. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, his heart suddenly hammering against his ribs, which was why he wasn't hiding this anymore. Isabella's eyes widened as he opened the box, revealing a ring, a simple platinum band with 3 stones, elegant rather than ostentatious. He told her he bought this the day after he found her in Chicago. He'd carried it with him every day since, waiting for the right moment. He took the ring from the box, holding it carefully, but he was done waiting for perfect moments. He was done overthinking and calculating. He loved her. He wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. He asked her to marry him. Tears spilled down Isabella's cheeks, but she was smiling. She said he was proposing while she was wearing his old shirt and hadn't washed her hair in 2 days. And their daughter was literally between them, making extremely undignified sounds. His voice was steady despite his racing heart. He said he was proposing because this was them, real and imperfect and absolutely right. So he asked what she said. Would she marry him? Her word came out choked with emotion. Yes, absolutely, yes. Dominic slipped the ring onto her finger. The fit was perfect because he'd stolen one of her old rings to get the sizing right. Then he kissed her carefully, mindful of Sophia sleeping between them, and felt something settle into place in his chest. This was everything he'd told himself he could never have, everything he'd been too afraid to reach for. And it was his, theirs, a family built from ashes and fear and love, strong enough to survive both. The move to New York happened 6 weeks after Sophia's birth. It was coordinated with the military precision Dominic had once applied to hostile takeovers. Professional movers packed their Chicago apartment, while Isabella supervised with Sophia, strapped to her chest in a carrier, offering instructions about which boxes were essential and which could wait. Dominic handled the logistics of the private plane that would carry them home, ensuring every detail was arranged for traveling with an infant. The Westchester estate was ready when they arrived. The nursery was painted and furnished exactly to Isabella's specifications. The security team was briefed and positioned discreetly. The kitchen was stocked with everything they might need. Marco met them at the door with a grin and an armful of gifts for Sophia. He welcomed them home and let them enter. He complimented Mrs. Castellano on her excellent taste in the house. Isabella corrected him that they weren't married yet, but she was smiling, and she thanked him, saying the house looked wonderful. The wedding happened 2 months later in a small ceremony at the estate. It was attended by close family and the few friends who'd proven trustworthy over the years. Isabella wore a simple cream dress that accommodated her post-pregnancy figure, her hair loose and adorned with flowers. Dominic wore a tailored suit and an expression of such profound joy that several guests commented they'd never seen him smile like that. Sophia attended in a white lace dress, passed between various relatives who competed for time holding her. She slept through most of the ceremony, waking only to cry during the vows, a moment that made everyone laugh and somehow made the whole thing feel more real, more perfectly imperfect. Dominic said his vows, his voice carrying clearly despite Sophia's protests in the front row. He promised to love Isabella through every challenge and celebrate every joy. to be her partner in all things, to trust her with his heart and his fears and his dreams, to build a life with her that was worthy of the love she'd shown him. Isabella's vows were equally heartfelt, delivered with tears streaming down her face, while Sophia's grandmother attempted to soothe the crying infant. She promised to trust him with her whole heart, even when fear tried to build walls between them, to meet every challenge as partners rather than adversaries, to build a family with him that was stronger for the struggles they'd survived. When the officiant pronounced them married, Dominic kissed Isabella with a tenderness that made several guests reach for tissues. And when they turned to face their small gathering as husband and wife, Sophia finally stopped crying and made a small cooing sound that could have been approval or sense. But everyone chose to interpret as a blessing. The reception was simple, elegant, filled with laughter and good food and toasts that ranged from heartfelt to hilarious. Marco gave a speech about watching Dominic transform from a ruthless businessman to a devoted father. He concluded by saying he never thought he'd see the day when Dominic Castellano changed a diaper at 3 a.m. But here we are. Love really does conquer all. Vincent Morty approached during the dancing, his aged face creased in a genuine smile. He congratulated Dominic and said his mother would have been proud to see him so happy. Dominic thanked him and shook the older man's hand firmly. He mentioned Marco said he wanted to meet about something involving his family. Vincent said it wasn't business, but something better. His eyes twinkled. He wanted to tell him in person that he was retiring, really retiring this time, not the half measures he'd attempted before, and he wanted him to know why. Dominic waited, curious despite himself. Vincent explained it was because he watched him choose family over empire, and it reminded him of what matters. He and his Rosa had grandchildren they barely knew because he'd been too busy maintaining power he no longer needed. Vincent glanced at where Isabella danced with Sophia in her arms. He told Dominic he was right to step back, right to prioritize love over fear. He was following his example while he still had time. The admission from the old crime boss was surprising and oddly touching. Dominic said sincerely that he was glad. Vincent deserved peace, he had earned it. Vincent patted his shoulder and said so had he, and congratulated him on finding it. He moved away, leaving Dominic to rejoin his wife on the dance floor. Isabella asked what Vincent wanted, swaying gently with Sophia, drowsing against her shoulder. Dominic said he wanted to tell them they made the right choice, that family matters more than power. He wrapped his arms around both of them, creating the protective circle that had become their signature embrace. He said Vincent was right. This, her and Sophia, this was everything. The seasons changed, bringing winter snow that blanketed their Westchester property in pristine white. Sophia grew with astonishing speed, going from a tiny newborn to a chunky 3-month-old who smiled at her parents with genuine recognition and delight. She was an easy baby, relatively speaking, sleeping in reasonable stretches, happy to be held by anyone willing to offer arms. She was fascinated by the mobile above her crib. Dominic and Isabella settled into their roles as parents with increasing confidence. The terror of the early days faded into a comfortable routine. They took turns with night feedings, tag-teamed diaper changes, and developed an efficient system for managing the endless laundry that somehow accompanied such a small person. One snowy evening, Isabella was watching Dominic play with Sophia on a blanket spread across their living room floor. She said she couldn't believe how much their life had changed in less than a year. Last winter, she was alone in that terrible Chicago apartment, terrified and convinced she'd never see him again. Dominic said now she was stuck with him forever, making exaggerated faces at Sophia until she giggled. No escape. Isabella agreed there was no escape, though she wasn't sure he got the better end of this deal. She came with extensive baggage and a daughter who would definitely inherit her stubborn streak. He said she already had it. Dominic tried to take away the rattle Sophia was gripping. She held on with surprising strength, her face scrunching into a determined resistance that made both parents laugh. He observed she was as stubborn as her mother and as protective as her father. Isabella stroked Sophia's dark hair, marveling at how much she looked like Dominic. She said she was going to be a force to be reckoned with. He replied, "That was good. The world needed more strong women who knew their worth." Dominic looked at Isabella with love so clear it still made her breath catch. Women like her mother, They stayed on the floor until Sophia fell asleep between them. Both parents were reluctant to move her to the crib and end the perfect moment. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing their home in peaceful silence. Inside, warmth and love created a sanctuary that felt impervious to anything the outside world might throw at them. When Sophia turned 6 months old, they threw a celebration that doubled as a housewarming party, inviting the carefully vetted circle of friends and family who'd become their support system. The house filled with laughter and chaos as Sophia was passed between admirers, showing off her newest skill, sitting up unsupported with obvious pride. Isabella's mother cornered Dominic in the kitchen, her expression serious despite the festive atmosphere. She said she wanted to thank him for making her daughter happy, for being the man she needed him to be. Dominic replied that he was the one who should thank her for raising a woman strong enough to give him a second chance, and for not having him killed when she found out he was the reason she disappeared. Isabella's mother laughed. She said she considered it, but then she saw how he looked at her in the hospital, how he held Sophia like she was made of glass, and she knew he was one of the good ones, even if it took him a while to figure it out. Dominic admitted it did take him a while, too long, but he was here now, and he wasn't going anywhere. She told him to see that he didn't, because if he hurt her daughter again, CEO or not, she knew people. The threat was delivered with a sweet smile that made it somehow more menacing. Dominic believed every word. He understood. As the party wound down and guests departed, Dominic and Isabella found themselves alone in the nursery, watching Sophia sleep after her exciting day. The room was perfect, soft colors and gentle light, every detail chosen with love and care. But more than the physical space, it represented something profound. This was the life they'd built from pain and fear and determination. This was the family Dominic had thought impossible, and Isabella had been brave enough to fight for. Dominic said softly that he wanted to thank her. For what? For running when she needed to, for coming back when he asked, for trusting him enough to build this life together. He wrapped his arms around Isabella from behind, both of them watching their daughter sleep, for giving him everything he was too afraid to want. Isabella leaned back into his embrace, her hands covering his where they rested on her stomach. She thanked him for proving her wrong, for showing her that the man she fell in love with was real, not just a fantasy she'd created. He said that man was never real. He was too controlled, too afraid, too convinced that power mattered more than love. Dominic pressed a kiss to her temple. This version, the one who changes diapers and researches sleep training methods and cries during children's movies, this was who he actually was. He said she helped him find him. They stood like that for a long time, watching Sophia sleep and counting their blessings. Outside, the world continued its complicated spin. Businesses competing, powers shifting, the machinery of life grinding forward. But inside their home, none of that mattered. Here there was only love and trust and the profound peace that came from choosing the right priorities. The years unfolded with surprising speed. Sophia took her first steps at 10 months, her determined expression making both parents laugh, even as they worried she'd fall. She spoke her first word at 11 months, Dada, which Dominic insisted was clear evidence of her superior intelligence, while Isabella rolled her eyes and reminded him that Dada was easier to pronounce than Mama. By 18 months, Sophia was a whirlwind of energy and personality, fearless in her exploration of their extensive grounds, while security teams watched discreetly from a distance. She had Dominic's dark eyes and commanding presence, and Isabella's delicate features and stubborn determination. She was, everyone agreed, the perfect combination of both parents. One evening, Dominic was watching Sophia toddle after the estate's very patient dog. He suggested they should have another one. Isabella looked at him in surprise. Another baby? He asked why not. They were good at this. Sophia could use a sibling, and he wanted a house full of children. Dominic pulled Isabella close, his hand resting on her flat stomach. A whole tribe of little Castellanos running around causing beautiful chaos. Isabella accused him of having gone completely soft, but she was smiling. The man who once said children were liabilities now wanted a tribe of them. He said he'd evolved, adapted to new information. He kissed her slowly, thoroughly. So he asked what she said. Was she ready to do this again? Isabella thought about the sleepless nights, the exhaustion, the complete upheaval that came with a newborn. Then she thought about Sophia's laugh, her tiny hands gripping their fingers, the overwhelming love that made every difficult moment worthwhile. She finally said yes. Let's have another baby. The second pregnancy was announced 6 months later. It was greeted with excitement from Sophia, who had no real understanding of what a sibling meant, and joy from their extended family. This time, there was no fear or uncertainty. Isabella sailed through the pregnancy with Dominic's full support, comfortable in the knowledge that they were partners in all things. Their son was born on a warm spring morning, arriving with less drama than his sister, but equal perfection. They named him Alessandro Dominic Romano Castellano, and he had Isabella's lighter coloring and Dominic's serious expression even as a newborn. Sophia was initially skeptical of the squirming bundle that had invaded her territory, but within weeks she'd appointed herself his fierce protector, insisting on helping with every aspect of his care. One night, Dominic was watching his daughter gently pat her brother's back while he slept. He felt his heart expand, with a love so profound it was almost painful. Both of them were exhausted as Alessandro nursed while Sophia sprawled across Dominic's lap, asleep after a long day of helping. Isabella said they had 2 children, 2 perfect children, and a life she never dreamed possible. Dominic corrected her, saying 3. 3 what? 3 children, maybe 4. He grinned at Isabella's expression. He asked why they should stop at 2 when they made beautiful babies together. Isabella said because she needed to sleep at some point in the next decade, but she was laughing. She suggested they survive these 2 first, then they would discuss expanding the tribe. They never did have that 3rd or 4th child. 2 was enough to keep their lives full and chaotic and perfect. But the hypothetical discussions became a running joke between them. Dominic periodically suggested they should try for a 3rd, while Isabella reminded him that sleep was precious and their family was already complete. The children grew, filling their house with laughter and noise, and the kind of beautiful chaos that only young children can create. Sophia started school, making friends with the careful supervision of security teams who'd learned to blend into the background. Alessandro followed in her footsteps, equally outgoing and confident. Dominic stepped fully away from day-to-day business operations, transitioning into an advisory role that required minimal time and allowed maximum presence for his family. He coached Sophia's soccer team, taught Alessandro to play chess, and spent his afternoons in ways that would have shocked his younger self. Attending school plays, hosting playdates, building elaborate blanket forts. Marco observed during one visit that he was completely unrecognizable from the man he met in that Manhattan office. Watching Dominic referee a heated game of tag between his children and Marco's own young son. Dominic replied that was good, catching Sophia as she barreled into him at full speed. That man was missing everything important. Isabella overheard from where she sat with Marco's wife, both women watching their husbands play with the children. She said softly that he really had changed completely. Sometimes she could barely remember the cold, controlled man from those early days. Marco's wife asked if she missed it, the excitement, the danger. Isabella's answer was immediate and certain. Not even a little bit. She gestured at their children playing, at Dominic's uninhibited laughter as Alessandro climbed onto his back. This was everything she ever wanted. The rest was just surviving until she found her way here. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Dominic surprised Isabella with a trip to Italy, just the 2 of them, while Sophia and Alessandro stayed with Isabella's mother. It was their first real vacation without children, a week of sleeping late, leisurely meals, and remembering what it felt like to be just a couple rather than exhausted parents. One evening over dinner in a small Roman restaurant, the Colosseum visible through the window behind him, Dominic said he wanted to renew their vows. Isabella pointed out they'd only been married 5 years, and that seemed premature for vow renewal. He said he didn't care about timing. He wanted to make those promises again, with the understanding that comes from actually living them. Dominic took her hand across the table. When they got married, they were still learning to trust each other, still healing from the pain of separation. Now they knew what they were promising. He wanted to say those words again with complete certainty. Isabella felt tears prick her eyes. She said he really was the most romantic man she'd ever known. He replied, only for her. His thumb traced circles on her palm. So, he asked, would she marry him again? She said yes, always yes. They renewed their vows on the estate grounds 6 months later, surrounded by friends and family, while Sofia and Alessandro served as ring bearer and flower girl, roles they took with extreme seriousness. The ceremony was simple, heartfelt, and considerably less chaotic than their first wedding, now that both children were old enough to sit quietly. Dominic said his vows, his voice steady despite the emotion shining in his eyes. He promised to choose her every day and every moment for the rest of their lives, to be the man she deserved and the father their children needed, to build with her a life worth living and a love worth celebrating. Isabella's vows echoed his sentiment, adding her thanks for him being brave enough to change, strong enough to admit when he was wrong, and loving enough to give her everything she never dared to ask for. When they kissed, Sofia announced loudly that it was gross while Alessandro giggled, and everyone laughed at the perfect imperfection of the moment. The years continued their march forward, bringing new challenges and joys in equal measure. Dominic's transition away from active business leadership became complete when Marco bought out his remaining shares, making the separation official. Some in their world whispered that Dominic had gone soft, that he'd lost his edge. Those people didn't understand that Dominic had found something infinitely more valuable than power. He'd found purpose. His days were spent in ways that would have baffled his younger self. Parent-teacher conferences, Little League games, dance recitals where Sofia performed with earnest concentration, teaching Alessandro to ride a bike, running beside him with a hand on the seat until the boy found his balance and took off on his own. One evening, Dominic told Isabella he was living the life his father never got to have, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set in shades of amber and rose. The peaceful years he was robbed of. Every moment with them felt like honoring his memory by choosing differently. Isabella said, leaning against his shoulder, that he'd be proud of him. His mother, too. They'd love seeing him like this, happy, at peace, surrounded by family. He said he hoped so. Dominic wrapped his arm around her, though he thought they'd be most proud of the woman who made this possible, who was brave enough to run when she needed to and strong enough to come back, who gave him a second chance he definitely didn't deserve. Isabella corrected him, saying he earned it. Every day he earned it. When Sofia turned 13, she came to them with questions about Dominic's past, having heard rumors at her private school about her father's history. Dominic and Isabella had been preparing for this conversation, knowing it was inevitable, but dreading it nonetheless. They told her the truth, age-appropriate but honest, about the world Dominic had operated in, the choices he'd made, the reasons he'd stepped away, about how her mother had disappeared and why, about the fear and pain that had preceded the family they'd built. Sofia listened with serious attention, her dark eyes so like Dominic's, processing everything. Finally, she said, "So you used to be bad, but you're good now." The simplification made both parents want to laugh and cry simultaneously. Dominic said carefully that it was more complicated than that. He did things he wasn't proud of, hurt people, made choices based on power instead of principle. But yes, he was trying to be better now, to be the man her mother and her brother deserved. Sofia said with the certainty of youth that he was the best dad anyone could have. Who cared what he did before she was born? The unconditional acceptance from his daughter hit Dominic harder than any threat ever had. He pulled Sofia into a hug, holding her tight while she squirmed and complained that he was being embarrassing. But she hugged him back, her thin arms strong around his neck, and Dominic sent up silent thanks for the second chance that had led here. Alessandro asked similar questions at 10 and received similar answers, adjusted for his age and temperament. Both children accepted their father's past as exactly that, past, separate from the present reality of bedtime stories and soccer practice, and unconditional love. On what would have been Dominic's mother's 75th birthday, he took Isabella and the children to visit her grave. It was something he'd avoided for years, but felt ready to face finally. They left roses, and Dominic introduced his mother to the family she'd never met. He said quietly, kneeling at the headstone while Sofia and Alessandro picked wildflowers nearby, that he wished she could have known them, wished she could have held Sofia and Alessandro, could have met Isabella and seen how happy she made him. But he thought she'd be proud of how they've lived, of the family they've built. Isabella's hand on his shoulder was warm and grounding. She said softly that she knew. Wherever she was, she knew and she was proud. The visit brought unexpected peace. Dominic had carried guilt for decades for not being able to save his mother, for choosing a path that would have disappointed her, for taking so long to find his way to a better life. But kneeling at her grave with his wife and children around him, he felt that guilt transform into gratitude. Gratitude for the life she'd given him, for the lessons she'd taught in her too brief time, for the example that had ultimately guided him home. Years passed with the strange acceleration that comes with raising children. Sophia grew into a thoughtful teenager with her mother's compassion and her father's strategic mind. Alessandro developed a talent for music, filling their home with piano melodies and guitar chords. Both children thrived in their secure, loving environment, unaware of how rare such stability was, how hard their parents had fought to create it. On their 15th anniversary, Dominic and Isabella stood on their balcony, watching the sunset paint their property in shades of gold. From downstairs came the sound of Sophia practicing a speech for debate team while Alessandro worked through a complicated piano piece. Both children absorbed in their own pursuits. Isabella said softly that they did it. They built the life they promised each other. Dominic corrected her, pulling her close. They were still building it. Every day they were building it. She asked if he ever regretted it, stepping away from power, from the empire he spent his life creating. Dominic didn't even hesitate, never, not once. That empire was built on fear and violence. He gestured at their home, at the sounds of their children living full, safe lives. This was built on love. There was no comparison. Isabella turned in his arms to face him fully. She said she loved him. She loved the man he'd become and the life they'd created, and every moment they'd shared, even the painful ones that brought them here. He said he loved her. She saved him from a life he thought was inevitable and showed him a better way. She was his entire world. They kissed as the sun completed its descent, the sky darkening into twilight while stars began to emerge. Inside, their children continued their activities, safe and loved, and blissfully unaware of the journey their parents had traveled to reach this moment. And Dominic, who had once built an empire on fear and control, who had sworn he would never allow himself the vulnerability of family, sent up silent thanks for the terrified woman who'd run away pregnant and the determination that had brought her back, for the second chance he'd barely deserved, and the love that had transformed everything. The house filled with light as Sophia turned on lamps and Alessandro called out asking what was for dinner. Dominic and Isabella went inside together, ready to face whatever came next, as they'd faced everything since that hospital room in Chicago. Together, as partners, as family. The empire Dominic had built was gone, dismantled by choice, and replaced with something infinitely more valuable, a home filled with laughter. Children who knew they were loved unconditionally. A wife who saw past the monster to the man beneath. And every night when Dominic tucked his children into bed and kissed his wife goodnight, he knew with absolute certainty that he'd made the right choice. That power was nothing compared to love. That an empire built on fear crumbled into dust, but a family built on trust could weather any storm. This was his legacy now. Not territory or money or influence, but 2 beautiful children and a love story that had survived everything fear could throw at it. This was enough. This was everything.